Terrible. If
Terrible.
I was going to have a small living area, then I would just have the bedroom be just the same size as the bed, essentially.
Yeah.
And then everything else to be the living area.
Very sensible, but I think we're all living in our bedrooms. First up, have you ever seen Alone? The series?
Yes.
It's pretty good.
It's extraordinary.
So people go out and they film themselves. They don't have film crews. They film themselves, often for like 100 days.
They are literally alone in the wilderness.
100 days in the Arctic wilderness.
Yeah.
Trying to feed. They're making an Australian one. We're going to meet Mike. He's just come out of the Tasmanian wilderness. I don't know how much he weighs.
Great.
Probably not much.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd leave a muffin there if I were you.
Wonderful. Richard Glover's show. Oh, so you'll be on Saturday night, won't you, for a special election broadcast between 6 and 10 in the evening. So
Sarah and I will be here. If you're out and about and want to know what's happening in the election, join our party.
Fantastic.
State of the party's party.
Exactly. Brilliant. That's coming up after the news headlines. I'll see you tomorrow.
Hello, I'm Sarah McDonald, the host of Mornings on ABC Radio Sydney.
And I'm Ashley Raper, New South Wales State political reporter for the ABC.
We have been hard at work for you on a new weekly podcast you are going to love. It's called Matters of State.
It's a weekly podcast that will keep you up to date with the state election and bring you in-depth analysis that digs beneath the surface of the campaign trail.
So join us for Matters of State. Drops Wednesdays on the ABC Listen app.
Good afternoon, Adam Story with an ABC News update. The federal opposition will back legislation setting out how this year's referendum on enshrining an Indigenous voice to Parliament will operate. The Coalition's demands for Commonwealth funding for the Yes and No campaigns has been rejected, but an official pamphlet will be distributed across the country outlining the respective cases. Police say they expect further arrests to be made after a confrontation erupted between LGBTQI+ activists and hundreds of people gathered outside a church in Sydney's southwest. A group of 10 activists were protesting against a speech being given by New South Wales One Nation leader Mark Latham at St Michael's Church in Belfield before a group of hundreds of people who'd gathered for the event turned on them. The state of New South Wales is challenging a damages payout to a former suspect in the disappearance of toddler William Tyrrell. Bill Spedding was awarded $1.5 million for being maliciously prosecuted by police as they searched for William Tyrrell, who went missing from a house at Kendall in 2014. State Labor says it will end the secrecy around privatised toll roads in New South Wales by tabling in Parliament key details of the existing toll contracts which were entered into over the last 12 years. It says releasing the details will provide an additional layer of transparency on the projects and ensure the public is fully informed about any additional costs. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia is ready to help Chinese businesses replace Western firms that have left Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. Putin made the comments during talks with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who was on a state visit to Moscow. The US State Department says it's deeply troubled by a vote in Israel's parliament to allow Israeli citizens back into 4 evacuated settlements in the occupied West Bank. The 4 settlements are considered unauthorised because they were constructed on what the Israeli High Court ruled was private Palestinian land. The chance of showers and a possible storm in Sydney this afternoon. Cloudy tomorrow with showers and a possible storm and a top of 28. More news at 4.
You're listening to Drive with Richard Glover.
G'day, Richard Glover with you on ABC Radio Sydney. Hope you're well. Today, police call out mob violence against rights activists after a church speech delivered by One Nation's Mark Latham. Dr. Michael Mosley ahead of his Sydney show. He'll be here first up after 4. It's all ahead here on ABC Radio Sydney, on radio at 7:02 a.m, on the ABC Listen app, on digital radio, on TV's Channel 25, and of course online everywhere. Let's check the traffic.
ABC Radio Sydney traffic.
And Jeff Wallace is here from the Australian Traffic Network. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Richard. Harbour Tunnel, very so I'm seeing from North Sydney, southbound in towards Moore Park by the ED, just coming through a crash at Harrington Park, southbound the Northern Road near Hillside Drive, and Cremorne Military Road, very busy. I'm looking at the cameras there, both ways at Rangers Road. Also the run past the M7, Cow Pasture Road, Green Valley, very slow heading down towards the M7. I'm Jeff Wallace from the Australian Traffic Network.
Jeff, thank you very much. Now, I wonder if you fancy yourself as a bit of an outdoor type. Can you get a fire started with no lighter on damp ground? Are you the person everyone turns to when their tent blows over? And have you ever had to deploy these bush skills in a situation where your very survival depended on it? Well, there's a special subset of outdoorsy people who take bushcraft to a whole new level. Survivalists. They enjoy the challenge of testing themselves against nature. Well, next week, you'll be able to watch 10 Aussies put their skills to the test in the Western Tasmanian wilderness when the SBS show Alone Australia makes its debut using a format which has already seen people battling extreme environments in places like Patagonia, northern Mongolia, and far northern Canada. One of the survivalists featured in the show is Mike, and he's here in the studio. Good afternoon.
G'day, thanks for having me.
I've watched the previous overseas shows. Did you, before you agreed to this?
Yeah, I'd watched about half of one series. I was pretty busy at the time when it came out, but as soon as the Australian applications opened, I binged all of them and got into it straight away. And it's amazing to be on it now after watching it, because everyone places themselves mentally in that situation, and to actually have the chance to do it's been really cool.
Yeah, but when you watch the overseas version, it's just terrifying. Some people quite commonly lose a third of their weight, their starting weight, for instance.
Yep, that's common.
They get so medically threatened that they have to tap out, or or the doctors force them out.
Yeah, they do. I seem to think Americans are more worried about things happening to their health than us Australians are. Like when I watch it, I feel that they had this fear, like, oh, something's going to happen to my body, and I don't have that feeling when I do things like that. But yeah, it's certainly, that's what happens. If there's not enough food to eat, you get thinner.
Yeah. Maybe the strategy should be go in huge like Santa Claus and just, lose a few kilos every week.
That was my strategy. So before, like, applications came out, I put it in, and as soon as I got the first inkling back, I dropped everything and put on as much as I possibly could.
Oh, you really? I thought you were kidding. You really did?
Yeah. I started out myself just thinking I could do it myself, and ate bacon and eggs and as much fat food as I could, but I quickly plateaued off. And then I saw a dietitian, and she diagnosed 10,000 calories a day, which is 4 times what I would normally eat. And I managed to stack on 19 kilos, and most of that was in the last sort of 6 weeks. So, yeah, I went in much heavier than I'd ever been in my life. So it was a completely new experience to put on 19 kilos. Probably the most I'd ever put on in my life would be maybe 4 kilos.
Ah.
So my skin didn't have a chance to stretch, so it was hard to breathe because my diaphragm couldn't open up, and it's like walking around with a big heavy pack on, but it's inside you. So.
How do you I suppose I'm asking about your self-image. How did you feel looking in a mirror when you were...
It was funny. People, because I had to keep it secret as well, and so that's also funny. People are just like, "Gee, Mike's
enjoying himself.
Yeah, he's letting himself go."
That's that great Australian, especially he's had a turn in the top paddock.
That's right,
in the good paddock.
That's right. But there is definitely an image thing. I remember walking past like shop window and looking at the reflection, just going, "Oh man, I've never seen myself like that." Yeah. It's weird.
Yeah. I mean, it was obviously you were going to get it seems to me it was obvious you're going to get the nod because you've got a great background for this, don't you?
Yeah, I do these kinds of things myself. So, yeah, but I didn't want to be too cocky about it. Like, a lot of it's not just about camera skills, and it's definitely not about camera skills. It's mostly about survival, but it's also, can you be yourself on camera? Mm-hmm. Really, that's
because we should explain for people who haven't watched the international versions. There's not a film crew with you, as is usual in reality television. You just really dumped in the wilderness on your own with a limited amount of tools and equipment and a camera with which you film yourself.
Exactly. So yes, a crew goes out when they drop you off, but that is it. And so it doesn't feel like there's any crew there. And even with my experience doing stuff on camera, there's a consciousness that you have of the camera. But the longer you're out there, the less that comes into play, and it's a little bit corny. It's a little bit like Castaway when Tom Hanks talks to his volleyball Wilson. The camera becomes your Wilson, and I hate that cliche, but it's kind of true.
Yeah, because it's partly obviously a physical challenge, of course, trying to keep yourself warm and keep yourself fed and keep yourself out of danger, all of those things. But there's a great psychological challenge of just being alone.
Yeah. For me, that's no challenge at all. So I grew up doing lots of stuff in the bush, and I started doing stuff alone just because I didn't have anyone to do stuff with, because my best mate moved away and I was living overseas and stuff. And so I just started doing stuff by myself. And once you start doing it, it becomes an acquired taste. You get so used to it, and you end up progressing in your own expedition skills to the point where it's hard to find anyone that can go with you and kind of keep up. So I'm very comfortable. So being alone that part of it is no problem at all for me.
Because you made a few documentaries already, haven't you? You made one where you went through the desert with your own camels, for instance.
Yeah, that was the second one I've shot. I haven't edited that one. The first main one I did was in the Kimberley, where I put myself in the situation of 2 lost German aviators to see if I could get out. So I'd actually done a fair bit of solo stuff before that as well, but that was my first filmed one. And then I did another one in Saudi Arabia with camels that I bought and trained myself. And then recently I did one up the Barrier Reef in a dugout canoe. That was 50 days by myself.
Reenacting a shipwreck, a famous shipwreck.
Yeah, trying to escape the survival situation of a shipwreck survivor. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about this series. So the 10 people are parachuted in, not literally parachuted in, but taken into the Western Tasmanian wilderness. What's that country like, and what are the challenges of surviving in it?
It's a really tough place. Well, first, geographically, it's kind of West Coast Tassie. You can see from the ads that it's inland. It's not on the coast. It's not on a beach. So it's hilly terrain. It's forested, and it's winter. So it's dark, cold, and wet.
I mean, it's seriously cold, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, by Australian standards, it's cold. So there is a difference with your North American series. Like, they get proper, Arctic kind of cold, but still for Australia, it's cold, and there's snow, and there's frost on the ground at times and stuff. So there's snow up high, not down where we were, but it's cold and it's dark. Short days, almost constant rain. So
you're not with the others, of course. Again, this is quite different to lots of reality TV shows. You're on your own.
Yeah, and that's a thing. It's not like it shouldn't fit in the category of reality TV, because reality TV is not realistic, whereas this, it is, because it is just us, and we are just filming with our own stuff. So there's no way you can re-edit the story. You either last the 100 days or whatever, or you don't. Yeah, absolutely. So, you've got to trust that they're going to do with the footage. I mean, you could end up looking like a total idiot. I mean, and if they played all the stupid things I did out there, I probably will look like a total idiot. So hopefully they'll mix it up with some of the things where I'm not looking like a total idiot. But, you just kind of just give into that. And I felt we only met the producers and everything for a week beforehand, but I felt we could trust them, with our...
Well, you kind of know what story they want to tell, which is the story of you trying to survive.
You do, but I shouldn't say this because I haven't seen the episodes, but I felt like if we just give them everything that is us, it won't be abused. And you can't always trust that for television shows.
Yeah, no. Well, certainly if you watch the overseas one, I don't think they don't seem to be. They seem to be just doing the obvious thing, because there's drama aplenty in it, because of course, these are people that they're trying to hunt animals, and they might find, yes, they've been successful in hunting animals, but these animals that they've been successful in hunting just don't have enough high fat content, for instance, to help them survive the winter. So they've got to get a particular animal that's got a high fat content.
Yeah.
There's drama aplenty anyway.
Oh, exactly. And that's why it's so popular, because it taps into, I mean, we all evolved in the outdoors and in that foraging sense. So many of us have a deep connection, some more than others. I've definitely got it. And the people that watch the show have it, but even it's certainly not just outdoorsy guys. Like, a lot of my wife's friends are just, before they knew I was on it, were just raving, "Oh, you got to watch your show Alone. I'm so invested." Women love watching it,
and there's some female contestants too.
Absolutely,
on this show.
Yeah,
Mike is here. He's one of the 10 contestants on Alone Australia. The double episode debuts next Wednesday, March 29, on SBS TV and SBS On Demand. What equipment do you have when you go in there?
We can choose from 10 items, basically, from a larger list. I don't know how many, maybe there's like 30 to 50 things on it. So part of the skill is choosing the things that are going to work for you best. But we didn't know where we were going. We knew it would be cold and wet. That's all we knew. So that's a skill.
So you might get a fishing line not knowing that you're not going to be near the sea.
Yes, effectively, yeah. Yeah, so that's a real problem. There's other clothing items that we can get as well, but it's fairly restrictive on what we could get. Yeah, but once you're out there, that's it. You just got.
And what about hunting gear? What about how to do that?
Well, that's tricky because Australia is a lot different to the States anyway. We have a lot of environmental rules here, which is good because we need them. So state by state, they vary a lot, and Tasmania is quite a restrictive place. So that certainly changes what you can and can't do. So if you couldn't use something, it wasn't on the gear list. You can kind of put it that way.
Okay. Do you have a gun?
No, definitely didn't.
Do you have a bow and arrow? I suppose you can make one of those, maybe.
You can, yeah, but in Tasmania, you're not allowed to use bows and arrows. Basically, it's the law down there. So there's restrictions like that.
So if you hunt, you have to hunt using traps, do you?
Yeah, you do, and even that's specific. Yeah, the way you do it is very regimented and supervised and everything. Not supervised by someone being there, but there's very strict rules on how it can be done, and that's a huge challenge.
How did you get hungry?
Oh yes, I mean everybody gets hungry out there. Yeah.
And how did you make a shelter?
Well, I can't give away what happened on the show yet, but
Sure,
I mean
sure.
that's.
But you presumably do this on day one, don't you? Make the shelter. You try to.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to, in that kind of situation, you've got to put something temporary up. But then the question is, do I make an elaborate one or do I make a small one? All these are really important survival decisions to make, and everyone's got to make it their own way. And it changes when you get out there. You might have all these plans in your head, but it all goes out the window the instant you set foot on the ground because you haven't seen it before.
In the Overseas series, there's these moments where people are fighting with themselves about whether to tap out, as they call it. In other words, to say, look, I'm so hungry, I'm so sick, I'm so cold, I'm finished with this challenge. Even though there's a big, I think it's $250,000 in this one and $500,000 overseas as the prize money, but they give in. Were you ever tempted to tap out?
I can't talk about those kinds of things, but I mean, you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all those kind of things. Like money's not that high up on that list.
So that's food and shelter.
Yeah. Well, safety's the first one, but yeah, shelter and those kinds of things. Once you've been out in a situation for a while, that just becomes your priority, and you're like, oh man, I was happy with life beforehand. That's the kind of thing that happens for people that haven't experienced the kind of hardship that alone is. If it's your first time, it would be like, wow. I already had in life what I wanted. I just didn't realise yet. It's a common thing that people go through.
What did you get out of not only this, but the other times you've effectively done something pretty similar? What do you get out of it?
Well, on my own adventures, because I've been through that hardship quite a lot of times, I kind of expect it. So I actually divorced the side of my brain that gives into discomfort. I just, if you're tired and you just got to, do I get up out of the chair and go and get something from the fridge? Like, if you think about that too much, the more you think about it, the more effort you've wasted in trying to decide whether you're going to do something. So the only way I can do my own filming expeditions and have the energy to film them myself is just to go, don't even think about how much this sucks, just do it. Mm-hmm. And you get in this habit where you can achieve a whole range of things if you switch that side of your brain off. So that's what I do it's just that kind of situation, being alone was natural for me. It's happened many times. So that kind of thing wasn't difficult for me.
How did you become that psychologically strong? Because I think you sound like you are.
It's from doing that kind of thing a fair bit. So I was lucky, when I grew up in Canberra, and I did, I went out. I lived in the suburbs. I'm not going to say I was, raised, in a tribe or something. Well, that would have been my fantasy though. But I just did a lot of things, expeditions, even when I was a teenager, camping out unsupervised when I was hikes when I was 13 and stuff.
Right, okay.
But then I joined the military and did a whole range of different things in the military.
You're a pilot with the ADF, weren't you?
That's right. Yeah, I was an Army chopper pilot and then an aeroplane pilot in the Air Force as well. And so I also had this fantasy because I watched Top Gun and The Bush Tucker Man, and they were my two fans.
Les Hiddens.
Yeah, exactly. So they were my two things that I wanted to do.
See, parents, be careful what you let your young children watch.
Exactly. So when part of the reason I wanted to go in the military was to get training like Les Hiddens, and so I got to do that a lot in Northern Australia and Southern Australia. So the more I did a lot of survival exercises, and then I started doing my own expeditions outside. So I've got used to that, the difficulty of it.
Mm. Mind you, bush tucker's difficult, isn't it? Because it obviously changes. You can do those lessons in the Northern Territory, but then you find yourself in Western Tasmania.
Absolutely. There's probably about 50% commonality in overall plant types. The plants can look different in different places, but Tasmania is a very difficult place anyway. Well, for starters, rainforesty places are a difficult place anyway, regardless of where you are in the world. But
not many edible fruits and
the sunlight doesn't get down to the ground as much. There's not as much grass, so there's not as many animals. There's just less food around. They're tricky places to survive, and so I researched Tasmania as much as I could before the show because I thought it was a good chance to be there. And researching the Palawa, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, from my research, they didn't stay inland in winter. They went to the coast. Even if that wasn't their tribal area, they had agreements where they could go and be there for winter time and then come back.
Very sensible.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And so we didn't have that luxury. We had to stay in one spot.
Yeah. Wow. And then, without telling me the ending and all of that, did you manage to meet up with the others, the other people, the other 10, the other 9?
No, we are completely separated. So we
So it's going to be great for you watching it, actually.
it'll be amazing, really amazing to see them again and to watch them, because I've got no idea what their sites even look like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're allowed to move, but you can't obviously invade someone else's site, but you move around a bit.
Yeah, we have boundaries that we're told, it's not a huge area. It might be, a few kilometres that way, a few kilometres that way, and don't cross that ridge line and don't cross the water source kind of thing. But that's about it. So, and it's such a varied area that I've been looking very closely frame by frame on the ads that they come out, and I'm like, oh, look at that place. It's so different to mine. Yeah.
Lucky duck. They would have had it easier. They had a river.
Yeah. Well, I think we all had water, but once again, I haven't seen everyone's site. So.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in Western Tasmania you'd probably have water, wouldn't you? Because people talk about going bushwalking there, and do you have to take water supplies? No, not usually, because there's so many little creeks and streams. And
yeah, I mean, it rains so much in winter in Tassie. Water for the survival side of things isn't hard, but yeah, it'd be kind of unfair if you didn't have access to some kind of water source. So I assume we all had access to water.
And you're not going to tell me how many kilos you lost?
No.
But I'll imagine lots.
Yeah, you just got to wait and see.
Out of that, what did you say? 17 kilos you put on?
Not 19.
19.
Yeah.
Well, that would have gone, and then some more. Well, I can't wait to see it. I've really enjoyed watching a few bits and pieces of the international series, and very nice to see that we've got it here as well. Thank you so much for coming in and talking.
No worries.
There you go. There's Mike. He's one of the 10. It all starts next Wednesday. Alone Australia, the double episode on SBS TV. The Herald, Adam Liao, has created this series of the 10 dishes you need to master, and he's begun with number 1, which is spag bol. But here's the thing, it's Australian spag bol, and Adam's contention is that all these arguments that people have about the authenticity of their spag bol and how well their spag bol matches the spag bol that was produced in Bologna 2 centuries ago, he says it's a lot of rubbish, because this is now an Australian dish and we make it in a particular way, and he's codified it, if you will, in today's paper, and he joins us on the line. Adam, good afternoon.
G'day, Richard. How are you?
Good. This is not spag bol. This is Australian spag bol, right?
Absolutely. There's imagine if you were in Vietnam and every time a banh mi came out, there was people complaining about how that's not how they make sandwiches in France. It's a bit silly. Every Australia, just about, vast majority of will make spag bol in some way, shape or form, and it doesn't need to be authentic. We have this weird obsession with, how a farmer in Emilia-Romagna might make a pasta dish 200 years ago. There's no bearing on how we eat in Australia other than providing some wonderful inspiration.
Yes, who cares? We make it our own way. And here's the thing, you say one of the particularities of how we make it is that it contains, the usual, I guess, onion and celery and stuff like that. But you say often the Australian version contains quite a lot of chopped veg, even offcuts like broccoli stems and things like that.
Optional, I a lot of families that will add a bit of extra veg into the bolognese to save from having a separate salad or something like that. The classic ingredients would be, I guess, mince, usually a mixture of beef and pork. Some people do just beef. And then obviously you've got your sofrito, so carrot, celery, onion. And then a lot of people add additional vegetables to that as well, kind of whatever they've got on hand. So it's a pretty basic thing. And then obviously you've got your tomato on top of that. However, whether you want to use tin tomatoes or passata, just throw it all together.
Now, you mentioned mince, and here's another little, well, some people might think controversial thing in your piece. You say you buy the cheap mince.
Yeah. The cheap mince is quite often the best for a lot of, to be honest. It's a little higher in fat, which some people don't like. But if you're making a hamburger, for example, it's better for that because you need the higher fat content. But when you come to, say, something like a bolognese, what it also has is a bit more connective tissue in it. And that's sort of the collagen from the connective tissue, after you braise it for a long time, will turn to gelatin. That's what gives you that kind of rich mouthfeel of your bolognese.
Okay, the one point at which I imagine you are absolutely in step with the person in Bologna 2 centuries ago is you say the magic happens in the third hour of cooking.
Yes, it does. It takes about that long to get from, I guess, the collagen to the gelatin, and 2.5 hours is about the amount of time that I cook my bolognese for.
But you're saying a lot of that thing where it gets that real silky mouthfeel, that comes right at the end. If you cut out the last half hour, cut out the last hour, you lose that.
You do. You get almost this sort of like the bitsiness of mince with it, and I think after you cook it for 2 to 3 hours, it becomes a more cohesive sauce. Nothing wrong with the short cooked bolognese. I had an awful lot of that growing up, but it's a slightly different thing. I think when I these days, I used to cook it much shorter. These days I add more liquid, more passata, maybe a little bit of water, and cook it for a lot longer to get that kind of richness in the sauce.
Yeah, now I love this codification because I think you have codified the way most people do it. This is kind of the way I do it. The one thing that was a bit new to me is you add a little bit of the pasta water to the sauce. Tell me about that.
So this process, mantecatura, is the mixing, I guess, the pasta with the sauce. So cooking the pasta till it's just al dente, until it's still quite firm, I guess, and then putting that into a pan with the sauce, sometimes a bit more oil, some of the pasta water, and kind of tossing that together. And that starchy water plus the starch from the pasta plus the oil plus the sauce kind of emulsifies together, and it makes sure the pasta is flavored. I think when you've got overcooked pasta that's kind of soggy and then you just pour a sauce on top of it, that's not ideal. I think all the pasta dishes I make, I'll mix them together, pasta and sauce together, to create a cohesive dish, I guess.
Okay, well, that's the one thing I haven't been doing. So next time I cook it, Adam, that's the way I'm going to do it.
It'll change your life, Richard. I swear it will.
And I'll be whistling Advance Australia Fair as I do it. Hey, Adam, thanks so much. Thanks for talking to us.
No worries. Cheers, Richard.
Adam Lior. He's got a new series in the Herald, The 10 Dishes You Need to Master, and it's kicked off today with what he calls Australian Spag Bowl. I must say, he says, look, let's not worry about these authenticity debates. And then in the comment section underneath the recipe, there are all these people still going on about the authenticity, as if all that matters is whether you can prove which way it was cooked. I remember we had I always thought it had celery in it, and I had a big argument, this is a long time ago on the radio, with Frank Sartor. Remember Frank Sartor? He was the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Italian origin, of course. And he said, Glover, you're an idiot. Of course you don't put celery in it. Ridiculous. And so we had a cook-off, and he made a bolognese, and I made a bolognese. And as I remember it, Gore Vidal was in town, and he judged it. So, I can't remember who won. It was probably Frank. 1 minute to 4 is the time here on ABC Radio Sydney. 23 degrees in the city, 21 in Camden, 24 in Gosford, 17 in Mount Boyce, 24 in Penrith and 23 in Cronulla. Partly cloudy today with a medium chance of showers, most likely in the afternoon and early evening, and the chance of a thunderstorm as well. Tomorrow, partly cloudy with a high chance of showers. Again, the chance of a thunderstorm tomorrow with light winds, a minimum of 19 and a maximum of 28. Frank in Beecroft says, I grew up with my mum, Italian, cooking pasta sauce every second day. She would cook it for half a day, 3 or 4 hours. And the house always smelled amazing. But someone else says, Adams, this is from James in Mossman, Adam's spag bowl takes 3 hours. That's un-Australian. Should take the time to down 2 glasses of red after a big day. That's Australian spag bowl. Lots coming up, including a visit in the studio from Dr. Michael Mosley. He's first up after the news at 4 on ABC Radio Sydney. It's news time now. That's 4 o'clock.
Afternoon, Adam Story with ABC News. The company Latitude Financial says it's uncovered more large-scale data theft impacting past and present customers. Amelia Turzon has the details.
The provider of credit cards and buy now, pay later products in major retailers hasn't said how many more of its customers' data has been stolen. It already revealed last week that around 330,000 people's information had been hacked and taken, including driver's licences and a small amount of Medicare numbers and credit card details. The company has almost 3 million customers and an unknown number of former ones. It's apologising to its customers and says that its call centres, which closed last week after the cyber incident, are operational again.
New South Wales One Nation leader Mark Latham says LGBTQI activists triggered a violent confrontation outside a church in southwestern Sydney. A group of 10 activists were protesting against Mr Latham's speech at St Michael's Church in Belfield last night before a group of hundreds of people who'd gathered for the event turned on them. Police say a number of projectiles were thrown at officers as they attempted to shield the protesters from the group. 2 men were charged with encouraging the commission of crimes and assault. Mark Latham says protesters shouldn't have blocked the street.
Any violence at a political meeting is unfortunate, inappropriate, to be condemned, but let's understand that this was instigated. The trigger for it was the protest organised on social media days earlier, apparently, by these left-wing transgender protesters.
A damages payout of $1.5 million to a former suspect in the disappearance of toddler William Tyrrell is being challenged by the state government. Here's court reporter Jamelle Wells.
The Supreme Court's been told the payout to washing machine repairman Bill Spedding will be challenged at a 2-day hearing in June. The 71-year-old was found to have been maliciously prosecuted as police searched for William Tyrrell when he went missing in 2014. Bill Spedding was a suspect, but after police searched his home, they found no evidence linking him to William Tyrrell's disappearance. He was then charged with child abuse claims dating back to the 1980s, but found not guilty. Bill Spedding argued the charges were to pressure him, ruined his life, and falsely portrayed him as a pedophile.
After weeks of evidence, the jury has retired to consider its verdict in the trial of former Melbourne school principal Malcolm Leifer. Joseph Dunstan reports.
Malcolm Leifer has pleaded not guilty to 27 charges against her, which date back 2 decades to her time in charge of the Adass Israel School. Prosecutors allege Mrs. Leifer took advantage of her position of power to sexually abuse 3 teenage sisters who had a sheltered upbringing and knew little about sex at the time. Sisters Nicole Meyer, Dussie Ehrlich and Ali Sapper took the stand during the trial, while Mrs. Leifer's legal team did not call any witnesses. The jury has now retired to consider verdicts and can only find Mrs. Leifer guilty if the charges can be proven beyond reasonable doubt.
British MPs investigating former Prime Minister Boris Johnson over the scandal that became known as Partygate will publish new documents ahead of a televised hearing later tonight. The former PM is facing accusations he misled Parliament over rule-breaking lockdown parties at Downing Street while he was leader. Mr Johnson was ousted from office last year after a string of scandals, but remains an MP. He could be suspended if lawmakers decide he deliberately misled them. Sri Lanka has received the first tranche of its bailout program from the International Monetary Fund. Nearly $500 million has been sent to the country to help it recover from a near economic collapse under the former government last year. The total IMF bailout is worth more than $4.4 billion. The funding will help other international lenders, including the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, to pour money into the South Asian nation. And New Zealand middle and long distance runner Zane Robertson has been banned for 8 years for doping. The 33-year-old competed at the Rio and Tokyo Olympics and won a bronze in the 5,000 metres at the 2014 Commonwealth Games. He tested positive for EPO, which stimulates red blood cell production and enhances performance in endurance events. That happened in a race in May last year. The Sports Tribunal of New Zealand says Robertson also interfered with the testing process. Showers and a possible thunderstorm in many parts this afternoon, more frequent across the south with moderate to local heavy falls possible, and storms in parts of the southern inland, the southern slopes and the far southern ranges. There's the chance of showers and a possible storm in Sydney this afternoon, and then cloudy with showers and a possible storm tomorrow with a top of 28. That's ABC News at 4:05.
You're listening to Drive with Richard Glover on ABC Radio Sydney.
G'day, Richard Glover with you on ABC Radio Sydney. Today, police call out mob violence against civil rights activists after a church speech delivered by One Nation's Mark. It's all ahead here on ABC Radio Sydney, on radio at 7:02 a.m, on the ABC Listen app, on digital radio, on TV's Channel 25, and of course online everywhere. What goes on in your bedroom? Well, there used to be a simple answer to that, but not in the era of working from home. The bedroom often contains both bed and desk, and probably a TV as well. Maybe that's why so many people are having trouble sleeping these days. The science of sleep is one of the topics featured in a live show with British science journalist Dr. Michael Mosley. It's on at the State Theatre tomorrow night, and Michael is here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Great to be here.
I wonder if the bedroom is just becoming too crowded.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So it's a place where people go and they watch telly and they are on their mobile phone. There are so many distractions, and part of the sleep message is that you should try and associate your bed with sleep and sex and nothing else.
Sleep and sex and nothing else. I was telling Josh earlier that I've got one of those little Apple devices, and when you plug it in, I've only got one television, it's in the lounge room, but when you plug in the Apple device, it calls that one television bedroom one. It assumes that the initial television is in the bedroom.
Yes, absolutely, and unfortunately it commonly is. So sleep habits in Australia are not great. One of the surprises for me when I started looking into it is Australians go to bed apparently before almost anyone else in the world. A recent survey of 100 people found that the average Australian goes to bed at 10:45. You also get up pretty early as well.
So why the difference, you think? That's odd, isn't it?
The Spaniards go to bed about an hour later than you do, and then you also get up pretty early, around 6:45.
What do the Poms do?
Poms are kind of around 11:15, so we're somewhere halfway in between, and then we also get up around sort of 7:30.
Yeah, it is. It is weird. I was reading a 19th century Thackeray novel the other day, and a lot of the action is set at kind of 2 a.m. in the morning. That's when the young man comes home, and that's when his mother has a discussion with him. And
absolutely. So there is this argument. I mean, I suffer from from insomnia. I wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning very typically, and one of the things I'm doing and talking about in the show is this series I'm currently making in Adelaide with the Flinders University, where we're taking 30 people who suffer from a range of problems with their sleep, and we're going to try and sort them out. So we're billing them as Australia's worst sleepers, and they suffer from a range of different stuff.
Okay, but one of the radical ideas is maybe we should be spending less time in bed.
Absolutely. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm doing sleep restriction therapy. So we have known for a long time, and this is actually quite effective. You think you ought to be spending more time in bed. If you're tired, you spend more time in bed. The trouble is you then spend more time in bed worrying. So you're thinking about, why am I not sleeping? It's going to be really bad for me. Or you're waking up in the middle of the night, whatever. So what they're doing, and I'm doing it myself right this moment, is cutting down to 6 hours in bed. So I now go to bed at about 11 and I get up at 5 a.m. And the idea is that by doing this, you get tired, but it also increases your sleep efficiency. So that means that you spend most of your time in bed asleep because you're so knackered. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you retrain your brain to associate bed, as I said, sleep and sex and nothing else. And once you've increased the efficiency of your sleep, so you're spending almost all your time in bed asleep, then you start to extend it. So you can increase it by half an hour, and so on and so on. It's actually a well-known behavioural technique, but for some reason it's not well known to the general public.
Okay, so you don't end up like Margaret Thatcher, sleeping 6 hours for the whole of her life.
Indeed, and then suffering from dementia.
Exactly.
Because, that is one of the serious downsides. One of the other things I want to demonstrate in the show is something called the spoon test. So people say to me, how much sleep should I get? And it's really down to how tired do you feel during the day. Are you one of those people who falls asleep at the traffic lights? Are you one of those people who falls asleep watching television or in the cinema or things like that? Well, you're probably sleep deprived, but one of the best ways of telling is an old test developed in the 1950s. You go to bed in the afternoon with a spoon and a metal tray, and what you do is you hang your arm over the bed. You look at your watch, it's 3 o'clock. You then close your eyes, and the idea is when you fall asleep, the spoon falls out of your hand, hits the metal tray, dong!
Wakes you up.
Wakes you up. You look at your watch. If it's been less than 10 minutes, that suggests that you are massively sleep deprived and that you ought to do something about it. So it's actually, we think that going to sleep fast is a sign of it's good. Actually, no, it's a sign you're pretty knackered.
What about early to bed, early to rise? Do you think that's true?
I think so, except huge range. Are you a lark or are you an owl?
I go to bed at 10:45, 10:45 and get up at, I don't know, 6:45 or something.
Yeah, you're exactly typical Australian in that case. You're
then Michael had a meat pie for breakfast.
So broadly speaking,
Pat McKelpie.
Broadly speaking, it is healthier, but some people are just natural larks. Some people are natural owls. Some people, they just, if they go to bed at 10:45, they'll be awake for 2 hours. I mean, one of the people who's taking part in the sleep study, that's what she does. But she then has to get up at 6 because she has a young child and her life demands it. So one of the things we've been doing with her is using these glasses which emit bright light.
Okay, I'll just describe them. They're kind of like a plastic, it looked like almost a big plastic safety goggle, but without any protective glass in
Absolutely, and they're like something out of the 1970s science fiction. Yeah, exactly. You look like someone, those guys who are shooting down people in Star Wars.
Yes.
So you look exactly like that.
And it's sending this bright green light into my eyes.
Absolutely. So the idea behind these glasses is that they reset your internal clock. So if you are somebody who is a serious owl, that means that you really struggle to go to sleep, at 11:45, 10:45, then you wear these first thing in the morning. If you're a serious lark like I am and you struggle to stay awake after 10 p.m., then you put them on late at night. And by doing that, you reset your internal clock. If you are an owl, another thing you can do is obviously go out into the bright light first thing in the morning.
Well, that's right. That's the other way of doing it. And a lot of people say that's really important, not just to open the curtains, but to actually expose yourself to significant light.
You have to go out because when you're indoors, a lot of the light is filtered out. Outdoors, it's like 10,000 lux. This is a measure of the intensity of light. Indoors, it's more like 100, 200. And part of the problem of modern life is the fact we spend all our time indoors, in buildings, in cars, public transport. Indeed, one of the best things if you want to kind of reset your internal clock and you suffer from insomnia is to go camping. Go camping for a long weekend. I've actually just been up in Mount Isa, talking with and learning from the indigenous population up there, and going walkabout is, used to be a kind of brilliant way of resetting the clock. And a lot of people from the indigenous community suffer from poor sleep because they've embraced the Western lifestyle. And it was absolutely fascinating talking with the elders about how they used to live, how the kids live now, and also about dream time and things like that.
Dr. Michael Mosey is here ahead of his show at the State Theatre tomorrow night. He's got a podcast and a book out at the moment too called Just One Thing, which we've talked about a little before. Why is sleep so important?
Oh, it's vital for every organ in your body, from your brains to your, sex drive. We've known that. The trouble is when you tell people this, all it does is scare them, and then they kind of lie awake worrying about stuff. I've read books which have, tell you from beginning to end you're going to suffer from dementia and things like that. But what you really want are answers. You want solutions, and there is a wide range of sleep problems. That's kind of why I'm making the series. I mean, one of the things, for example, my wife, Dr. Claire Bailey, she's going to be on the show. She's going to be doing cooking demos. Now, Claire suffers suffers from parasomnia. That means she does sleepwalking, sleep talking. Frequently, when she's stressed, she will climb over me in the middle of the night looking for patients. She's convinced there are patients under the bed, in the cupboard, or whatever it might be. And she has these intense waking dreams. I mean, in terms of parasomnia, I came across one woman who used to drive to work in the middle of the night, asleep. And she would wake up in the car park at work at 3 a.m. And she had no idea how she got there. Can you imagine driving to work?
I mean, well, there's been some famous court cases, haven't there, where someone's travelled halfway across Canada and done a terrible crime and said, look, I was asleep.
Absolutely. And that's kind of what I love about sleep. It is sort of crazy stuff. I've also got a wonderful gadget here I was given to help people who snore. The snoring is a big problem in Australia.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Does that sound familiar? Even worse is actually when you stop the snoring, because if you're doing at least you're breathing. What the scary bit is when you're going and then
that's sleep apnea, right?
That's sleep apnea,
Yeah.
and we discovered in this study a huge number of Australians have sleep apnea. Now, this is a weird-looking device. It's the sort of thing you might put on a dog. It's a kind of collar thing you put around your neck, and it's got a big black box, which is a couple of centimetres by a couple of centimetres.
Yeah, it looks like a dog collar with a big square matchbox on it.
Absolutely, and you attach that, basically put it on at night, and when it detects you're lying on your back, it gives you a shock. So
a small electric shock.
It's more a sound thing, and that is a nudge to tell you to roll over. At the moment, I have to say, the main impact is that it wakes Claire up, and she then hits me. But and last night, we actually it came off in the night, and we were woken by this buzzing noise, which was somewhere in the bed, and we had no idea.
That's right, because it was regarding itself as being on its own back. Can we talk about some of the things, you've been doing this now for 10 or 20 years, some of the things that were believed 10 or 20 years ago that science has now decided are really not true. I mean, one of the most obvious things, I just remember so intensely people saying, don't miss breakfast, don't miss breakfast. It's the most important meal of the day. And that's not commonly said now.
It's not commonly said. Well, it's still commonly believed, I think. What people don't know is that was a marketing slogan developed by someone working for the Kellogg's Corporation in, I think it was 1915. And it's taken over this sort of mantra of good health. Now, if you like breakfast, great. But I was talking about time-restricted eating, which is extending your overnight fast. There is some evidence that that is beneficial. And if you kind of stop eating within 3 hours of going to bed and delay your breakfast, that seems to be good. In the show, I talk quite a lot about the origins of some of these beliefs that we still have, which turn out to be absolute nonsense, but which, I mean, I have spent, a lot of my life debunking myths. And I was inspired to it by this fabulous Australian I've spoken about before, Barry Marshall.
Yes.
And his work on ulcers. So I'm absolutely going to be talking about him.
Well, he's a great self-experimentalist like you.
Absolutely. And he's the guy who got me into self-experimenting. And indeed, he's the guy who, in many ways, the reason I went in front of the camera. So I'm also going to be talking in the show about the time I infested myself with tapeworm and why I did it.
Yeah.
And so if you want to see tapeworm inside me, this is your opportunity.
Because, of course, for people who don't know the story, and it's a great Australian story. He won the Nobel Prize for this, but basically it was believed that ulcers were caused by all sorts of things, and people would stress and anxiety, and that would make people even more stressed and anxious, and people would take bottles of Mylanta and try to calm down, and it was nothing to do with that at all, he proved.
Absolutely. This was back in the 80s. I made my first ever documentary with him at the beginning of the 1990s. He basically said, look, it's actually a previously unknown bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and to demonstrate it, he swallowed it and induced ulcers in himself, and then he cured himself. So when I made the film, this was regarded as heresy, nonsense, but he won Nobel Prize, he and Robin Warren. And similarly, I've been banging on recently about the fact that type 2 diabetes is a curable disease, but I meet exactly the same opposition, which basically says this is nonsense. We've known for a long time.
Well, you proved it with yourself.
Absolutely, and huge clinical trials have been done. So that's kind of one of the reasons I want to come and do a live show. But also, what I love about a live show is people come and tell you afterwards about the stuff. A guy came up to me after a show recently. He had lost 70 kilos, 70, and he had come off insulin, off all his medication. He was about to have his knees replaced. He's absolutely fine. And indeed, he's taking up kickboxing now. But he said the main thing is he can play with his grandkids. And his kids say, why don't you play with us? Why didn't you play with us? And he said, I was overweight. I couldn't do it. I didn't have the energy. I was tired. And so I love these stories. And as I said, I'm going to be hanging around after the show. Anyone wants to ask me questions. Very interactive show.
Talking about the great myths of the last couple of decades, weight loss must be slow.
Yeah, no, it turns out the rapid weight loss, if you do it properly, is unbelievably effective. And there have been some really big studies showing that when you compare the two, the people who do the rapid weight loss, if you do it properly, they are the ones who actually see the long-term benefits, which is the exact opposite of what we've always been told.
Which doesn't mean it's not a struggle not to put it back on again.
100%.
But that's true too if you lose it slowly.
Absolutely. There's no difference in that sense. But what we know is that the damage that is done by being overweight is to do with the amount of time you've been overweight. It's like smoking. The longer you've been a smoker, if some people give up smoking, take it up again. You kind of think, again, yo-yo dieting is bad for you. And yet, no, it doesn't appear to be that. It's the amount of time you've had excess fat on your body that seems to be the problem, not kind of, whether you lose it, put it on and that sort of stuff.
Okay. I think this is not in quite the same category of myth, but it's kind of generally believed that you've got to have a gym membership to be fit. And it seems sometimes that the opposite is true, that it's building into ordinary day-to-day life, these small little hacks can be either more effective or just as effective.
Absolutely. And I'm not a fan of the gym at all. And people also, one of the great myths is that exercise is a good way of losing weight. It's not. It's a terrible way of losing weight. A lot of people believe that if you exercise, this will increase your metabolic rate and the calories you burn. A recent study showed this is absolute nonsense. In fact, exercise slows your metabolic rate over the course of several days because your body is actually trying to recover the energy. And the reason it does that is because we evolved at a time when calories were scarce. So a lot of things that people believe turn out to be complete nonsense. And that's one of the things I'm talking about in the show.
Okay, because you can build into your ordinary life. You talk about, in just one thing, you talk about a lot of tiny things. Anna Louise Bouvier, who comes and visits us too, talks about these little tiny things. It might be standing on one leg when you're cleaning your teeth.
Absolutely. It can be going for a brisk walk. It can be going up and down the stairs. Strangely enough, the evidence suggests that going down the stairs is even better for you than going up the stairs. And who would believe that? But someone's done the study and they demonstrate it's true. And that's what I love. And, I see people on escalators and they're going down the escalator. And I think at the bare minimum, you could actually walk down the escalator. It's not that big a challenge. And yet people just stand there. And I just want
to... And leave your gym membership at home. Dr. Michael Mosley is here. I suppose the one thing that has had a lot of consensus now for a lot of time is the Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
That highly processed foods are really pretty terrible for us. And the only part where the science has changed is to say they're terrible for us in a whole lot of ways. Not only are they terrible for us in terms of longevity and physical health and weight, but they're really important in terms of mood, in terms of controlling things like depression.
100%. And some great work by Professor Felice Jacka down in Melbourne, Food and Mood Centre. She's the first person who really did a proper clinical trial, which demonstrated if you take people who suffer from moderate to serious depression, you change their diet from a typical Australian diet to a Mediterranean diet where you've got olive oil, nuts, veg, a glass of red wine and lots of healthy protein, within a remarkably short period of time, many of them, their symptoms will improve.
It's counterintuitive though, isn't it? Because you think, what's down here got to do with up here?
Absolutely. And the link seems to be the microbiome, the gut bacteria, that if you change that, you encourage the growth of these anti-inflammatory microbes in your gut. Then one of the emerging theories about depression is a lot of it's to do with inflammation in the brain. So Felice Jack and her team did the first trial. Since then, loads of research done, particularly in students, showing change the diet within a few weeks. You see these improvements in depression, anxiety and things like that. And I think that is extraordinary and one of the new great revolutions.
Does it matter, this is on a question without notice on the text, does it matter if you get your 7 or 8 hours sleep over 2 periods of sleep, say 5 hours at night and then 2 hours in the afternoon?
Only if you're bothered by it. If you're not bothered by it, then fine. There is a theory, you were talking about Thackeray and other people, Dickens, they used to write about what's called the first and second sleep. The people in pre-industrial age often went to bed at about 9. They got up at 2 in the morning. They did some spring cleaning. A French manual said it was the best time to have sex. And then
in the bedroom, but not anything else.
And then they might go back to bed for a bit later and then sleep until the morning. So the idea of a first and second sleep was universally accepted. Napping is a very good thing to do, but preferably within about a couple of hours of lunch, and preferably no more than 20 minutes, because otherwise it will reduce your sleep drive that night.
I might just find out, I wonder if COVID and the lockdowns and working from home did make all of this stuff worse. I know when I was working from home, it was in my bedroom, so my bed was there, my desk was there. I'd run this show from my desk and then 3 hours later go to bed a sort of half a metre away.
Absolutely. I've no doubt at all that it contributed to it. And also, when you're getting poor sleep, you were probably popping down into the kitchen and make yourself a snack. So the whole thing kind of builds on itself. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Have fun at the beautiful State Theatre tomorrow night. And go up and ask your questions afterwards too. Michael, thank you. What a pleasure to have you in the studio. We often talk to Michael Mosley, but it's usually down the line to the UK. His live show is on tomorrow night at the State Theatre. And the book and podcast that I mentioned is called Just One Thing. And it's a suggestion of these tiny little changes you can make to your day-to-day life, which can have a much bigger impact than maybe the huge and expensive gym membership. It's 25 minutes past 4 here on ABC Radio Sydney. We'll check the traffic in a second with Jeff Wallace, but before that, the day in finance. And Ian Verinder joins us, our ABC business editor. Good afternoon.
G'day, Richard. How are you going?
Yeah, good. Another solid day on the market today.
Yeah, look, second one in a row, so we're doing quite well, really. But look, it seems as though the chaos that descended over much of global banking and the financial system over the past few weeks started to abate, and Wall Street also extended its recovery overnight. So we're kind of keeping pace with them. Look, it was a good day today. The miners, oil and energy stocks, banks, everything pretty much advanced. But look, last night's advance on Wall Street followed comments by the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen when she said that, she indicated at least that the US government may extend protection of bank deposits across the system. Now, she wasn't, it wasn't a blanket coverage. She's essentially saying that any bank that gets into trouble that is really quite crucial to the financial system, they will think of doing this. Now, they did it just last week with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. And I guess if you're banking in the States with a smaller bank, though, you'd probably be looking to move elsewhere, really, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm. Now, there is a big decision in the US tonight about interest rates, which will feed into all of this.
Yeah, this is going to be crucial. This is the first meeting of the US Federal Reserve since these ructions first appeared a fortnight ago. And look, hark your mind back to just a week ago, and the European Central Bank actually did raise interest rates by, it was a double rate hike, 0.5 percentage points, right in the middle of all of this happening, which surprised quite a few people because it was pretty clear at that stage that the interest rate hikes that have been pushed through have really started to impact on the financial system. But it was almost as though they didn't want us to be seen to be cowered into submission by what was going on markets. But look, there's a lot of concern out there at the moment about how much further rates can be pushed. Look, 2 weeks ago, if the consensus pretty much was that the US Federal Reserve tonight would raise rates, and now it's really no one's got any idea what might happen. But there's a lot of, concern about what the impact would be if they do. And look, the thinking now for us, at least, is that the Reserve Bank is more than likely to hold off on a rate hike when it meets in a couple of weeks' time.
Now, when these Australian companies get cyber attacks, it often seems to take a few days for us to realise how severe it is, and that's certainly been the case with Latitude.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, Latitude is the old GE money, so it's got a lot of customers, a huge number of customers, in fact, and it does a lot of retail work for the likes of Harvey Norman and so forth. On March 16, it announced that there'd been a cyber attack, and just like Medibank, the situation just seems to deteriorate each day when they're reporting things. So on the 16th, they said that there'd been probably around about 100,000 customers affected, mostly driver's licences and a few other things that they couldn't quite identify. By March the 20th, that had gone up to 317,000 driver's licences, plus potentially passports and Medicare numbers. And now they say that there's further evidence that there's been large-scale data theft, not since then, but they're uncovering more and more each day. So the situation does seem to be getting worse. And look, it just seems to be spreading out over a vast number of companies now. And we've all freely given our data out on request. I mean, you'd have to start to think twice about doing that in the future, really, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, if it's not stored safely. Now, just the All Ords and the dollar to finish.
So the All Ords today up almost 1% actually. So to where we at 7,243, and the dollar's sitting just below 67 cents.
Good on you, Ian. Thank you very much.
ABC Radio Sydney Traffic.
Ian Verender, our ABC business editor, and here's Jeff Wallace from the Australian Traffic Network. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Richard. Now, Mount White, the M1, watch out if you're heading northbound and have a breakdown lane 2 near the way station. They're calling a crash, same location, lane 3, so a bit of confusion for the M1 Mount White northbound. Also, I'm just seeing through Penrith, very slow Mulgoa Road south of the Great Western Highway, Jamison Road both ways. Harbour Tunnel northbound, southbound, very slow. And Collerton, a broken down truck for southbound Carlisle Avenue at approaching Raper Road. I'm Jeff Wallace from the Australian Traffic Network.
Jeff, thank you very much. David Sears with the day in politics in a tick, but let's take the latest news headlines. Adam Story, good afternoon.
Sorry, Richard.
Yep.
Just a couple of seconds behind you, as usual.
I'm going to do it again. It's going to be a big thing. Here we go. Adam Story, good afternoon.
Thank you, Richard. Residents in Menindee in the state's far west are awaiting results of water quality testing after the mass fish kill there. Local authorities have confirmed the overall scale and size of the kill has eclipsed similar events in the area in 2018 and 2019. The state of New South Wales is challenging a damages payout to a former suspect in the disappearance of toddler William Tyrrell. Bill Spedding was awarded $1.5 million for being maliciously prosecuted by police as they searched for William Tyrrell, who went missing from a house at Kendall in 2014. The federal government has reached a deal with the opposition about how the referendum on enshrining an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the constitutional work, but the coalition's demands for Commonwealth funding for both sides of the debate has been rejected. And protests have continued throughout the night in Paris after the French government narrowly survived a no-confidence vote yesterday over its pension reform plans. More ABC News at 5.
Adam, thank you very much. Just a few texts coming in. Re the mob violence yesterday, says one texter. No one seems to be asking why a Catholic parish is hosting a party political event, let alone one by a party that espouses hatred towards vulnerable and marginalised people. There's nothing Christian about prejudice and hatred. Can you ask Archbishop Anthony Fisher why a One Nation event happened on church policies, the church endorsing One Nation? That's a text from one of our listeners, and from Nick on the subject of bedrooms and televisions and Michael Mosley's contention that it's sex and sleep and that's it. You can put on your shoes, but that's about all in the bedroom, according to him, if you want to have a good sleep life. No TVs, no screens, no work desks, none of that. Nick says, I have no choice in the matter. My wife prefers the TV in the bedroom, which means I often have trouble keeping awake during programs I want to watch. I use earplugs, so I'm usually asleep by 8:30. Up by 4 a.m. though, says Nick. So, yeah, I wonder if you have the television in the bedroom. I mentioned to Josh earlier, I have a friend who's wanting to sell the suburban house, the house in the suburbs, sick of doing the garden, wants to buy a smart, apartment. And he says the problem is that all the apartments that they've visited, anyway, have got these huge master bedroom, as they used to call them, huge bedroom, which has got the TV and everything, and then a tiny, tiny kitchen and a tiny, tiny entertaining area. And they love to have dinner parties and all that, and they don't want to. And so he says, when you walk in, as soon as you walk in, you understand the lifestyle that's meant to be had in this place. You're meant to come home from work, kick off your shoes, lie on the bed, get the Uber Eats, get stuck into the Uber Eats while lying on the bed, then watch the television, and then, presumably fall asleep. Well, it's a life, I guess. It's 28 minutes to 5 here on ABC Radio Sydney.
Members on my right.
Well, hang on.
Members on my left.
I will not be lectured about sexism. You sit down, Buffett.
Order. Mr. Speaker. Google it, mate.
How pathetic. What sort of person does that?
Order, Buffett.
And joining us is David Spears, host of Insiders on ABC TV, the program which, after having that glorious Saturday night, which I just described, you can then bleary-eyed wake up, get out of bed, push the Uber Eats crap to one side, turn on the television and watch David and his friends.
Exactly. It's so easy. It's
so easy.
Doesn't sound like a terrible night, though, I must confess, the Uber Eats and
I don't know. You wouldn't sleep properly. That's the point.
Look,
yeah, you'd be up at... Yeah.
Depends how much Uber Eats is involved, I guess.
I guess so. Yeah, but it's bad. It's bad habits.
Bad habits.
It's bad habits.
No.
Yeah. Now, the referendum machinery bill, as it's called, is.
Yes.
It seems that the government has reached a deal with the opposition.
So this was meant to be the easy one, if you like. And look, yes, now they have reached an agreement on this. It's not the bill to have the referendum on the voice. It's the bill to tidy up, update, if you like, the rules on how we run referenda in Australia. Because it's been a while, Richard. What has it been? More than 20 years since we did one. Much has changed since then. And so these arguments about, how should they actually be run, what this bill does is bring that up to speed with modern communication and so on. However, what the opposition were demanding were a commitment to fund both the yes and no campaigns in any referendum. Peter Dutton for weeks has been demanding that. Today, he's retreated from that position, but he has won a few other minor concessions. One we already knew of. The government will be issuing a pamphlet, so we'll all get something in the mail telling us the yes and no campaign case in simple principle terms. And there will be what's called deductible gift recipient status for both sides. Means they can take donations, they can be gift deductible, tax deductible. So a couple of minor concessions, but this will go through tonight. That's done. Then comes the trickier question, and that is the bill to have the change to the Constitution to set up a voice to Parliament.
Yeah, and there are kind of real questions that seem to be being debated. One example is whether the voice people should be able to should be limited to giving their advice to Parliament, or whether they should be able to also advise the executive. Now, it's quite an interesting argument, that, isn't it?
Look, it is. So, the machinery bill will get through. That's done. Now we can move on to the real stuff, right? And this is, you're right, the debate around how the voice works, the principles around it, how much detail is required. And you can already, there's a couple of things going on. Tonight, the Prime Minister is meeting with about half a dozen members of what's called the Referendum Working Group. It's a big group of 21 Indigenous Australians that he set up to provide advice to the government on what the final wording should be. They've been pretty adamant from the get-go. There shouldn't be much change to what the Prime Minister announced at the Garma Festival last July, that it's a voice to Parliament and executive government. There have been some concerns from others that it needs to be legally tighter, and the Attorney General and the Solicitor General attended a meeting of the working group a couple of weeks ago to canvass some ideas. The group didn't like many of them. They've been through a painstaking process to get to this point, don't want to water it down any further. But, while the PM can hardly afford to lose the support of his working group, I mean, that would sink the whole thing, he's also keen to try and keep as many Conservative supporters of the voice on board as he can. He's not going to get full bipartisanship, but if he can get a bit, that's clearly going to help a lot. So tonight they're going to try and finalise this thing with that small handful of members of the working group.
I mean, the problem with that argument about only being allowed to advise Parliament is often all the decisions are already kind of in place in the bill by the time Parliament gets to decide on something. The real point of where you want the input, in a way, that really local input of what's needed, what life is like on the ground, is when the public servants and others are trying to form the policy in the first place. You want it early on.
Yeah, by including executive government does a couple of things. It includes the cabinet, decisions the cabinet's making. It also includes what you're referring to there, administrative decisions of the bureaucracy as well. And that's often, yes, the legislation's important, but what the senior bureaucrats are doing in administering the law, that matters too. Now, the critics have said this will open up everything government does to court challenge. Now, a lot of that criticism is overblown, but what they're trying to find is a way through with maybe a few extra words that, ensure This isn't completely open to everything being challenged, but still give the principle here, and that is an opportunity for an Indigenous voice to advise Parliament and the executive government.
Well, if I'm the public servant and I'm trying to work out, I don't know what the liquor law should be in Alice Springs down to the fine detail, I want to. That's precise to the point. I'm about to give 3 bits of advice to my minister that he or she can choose from. That's exactly when I want to get some local input, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Although I do think over the coming months, it is going to be worthwhile to have some of this ventilated, debated, explained. Will it include environmental approvals, for example? What sort of input from the voice to Parliament and government would be taken on board? How would that be dealt with? Decisions like the Prime Minister's recent decision to reimpose some of those alcohol restrictions around Alice Springs. Some of these are fairly obvious areas where, the advice of the voice would be really welcome. There might be other areas where you say, well, that's going to slow things down. So it's probably worth explaining a bit more about how this will work in practice.
Well, let's listen in to the Special Minister of State, Don Farrell. He says he appreciates the coalition coming to the negotiating table.
And I think it's an example of how constructive the government and opposition can work together to get the best result for the Australian people.
Yeah. Now let's listen to the Country Liberal Party Senator Jacinta Price. She says the coalition's demands for Commonwealth funding for both sides of the debate have been rejected.
I'd like for an official yes and no campaign to be funded, and if that's not available, then I will be crossing the floor. Obviously, Mr Dutton has his reasons. I've yet to have a conversation with Mr Dutton, but I'd like to be able to have a conversation with Mr Dutton.
Okay, but in practice, if you've got a pamphlet which tells you both sides, and then you've got what I'm sure will be relatively supported and funded campaigns on both sides, what's the problem?
Yeah, and why do you need taxpayer funding?
Yeah.
It is what we heard there from Jacinta Nampijinpa Price really highlights the division that Peter Dutton is going to be facing on the bigger question around the voice itself within the coalition. I mean, they were quite split today on this machinery bill. You heard there Jacinta Price saying, no, we still want the taxpayer funding, and I'll cross the floor if we don't get it. I'd like to have a conversation with Peter Dutton about this. Meanwhile, downstairs in the Senate chamber, the Libs were confirming they've done a deal. They're not pushing for that taxpayer funding anymore. So, yeah, there are divisions there in the coalition which are going to be a little tricky for him to manage.
David Spears is here. Now, talking about difficult negotiations, this safeguard mechanism bill is causing a lot of heat between the Greens and the government.
Sure is. And I thought this week's IPCC report really sharpened the debate too about the need for action. But look, depending on who you listen to, this is Labor versus the Greens we're talking about here. Chris Bowen has been arguing the last couple of days in Parliament. If we don't get this through, we'll only get 35% emissions reduction by 2030, not the 43% they've committed to. The Greens are arguing, well, if this passes as it's proposed, there'll be more coal and gas, and emissions from coal and gas will be going up. And we need to do a whole lot more. We need to listen to the IPCC and ban new coal and gas. So they're both kind of using the IPCC report to make their case here. There's still no sign of either blinking, Labor or the Greens here. I still suspect there will be a deal by the end of next week. That's when they've got to get this deal done. But it's a high stakes moment for both sides. Really, neither can afford for this to go down, I would have thought.
Well, let's listen in to the Green Senator, Sarah Hanson-Young. She says the party is in negotiations with the government over the safeguard mechanism bill.
We've always said it wasn't an ultimatum, it was an offer, and we want to work with the government to cut pollution. So rather than being stubborn about this, the Minister and the Prime Minister and the government need to take those dire warnings seriously.
There's Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. And as David mentioned, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, well, he just talked about the importance of the bill going through.
The consequences of the safeguard reforms not passing are very real for our region, very real for the Pacific, because our targets of 43%, which were legislated by this Parliament last year, will not be met without passing the safeguard mechanism. Our projections show that, in fact, the achievement by 2030 will be 35%, Mr Speaker. Now, that is the choice facing this Parliament. Targets can be set. It's easy to call for higher targets. It's easy to call for more action. The difficult part is implementing that action.
Well, there you go. There's Chris Bone bringing us to an end of David Spears' Day in Politics. And yeah, next time I push the Uber cartons to one side and stumble bleary-eyed from the bed on a Sunday morning, it'll be only to see David's smiling face on the other side of the screen.
I'll be thinking of you amidst your
detritus, the detritus of my meal and of my life. Hey, David, thanks so much.
Thanks, Richard.
There's David Spears, host of Insiders on ABC TV. It is 16 minutes to 5 here on Drive. Let's check the traffic.
ABC Radio Sydney traffic.
At Milperra, M5 motorway approaching Henry Lawson Drive, a truck breakdown there, westbound traffic affected. At Milsons Point, Sydney Harbour Tunnel approaching the tunnel exit, a car breakdown there, northbound traffic is affected. And Waterfall, McKell Avenue between Lady Wakehurst Drive and the vehicle trail, that landslide continues to affect traffic in both directions. That's the latest. If you want to call us, 1300 222 702 or on the text 0467 922 702. Have you allowed the TV set into the bedroom?
You can find us in lots of places. On the ABC Listen app, on radio at 7:02 a.m, on digital radio, TV channel 25 and online. This is ABC Radio Sydney.
Richard Glover with you on Drive. Current temperatures around town, 24 in the city, 21 in Camden, 24 in Gosford, 15 in Mount Boyce, 23 in Penrith and 21 in Cronulla. The forecast for tomorrow, Thursday, a minimum of 19 and a maximum of 28, partly cloudy, high chance of showers and the chance of a thunderstorm with light winds. For Friday, a minimum of 19, maximum of 26, partly cloudy, very high chance of showers most likely in the afternoon and evening, light winds becoming south to southeasterly, 15 to 20 kilometres during the day, then becoming light during the afternoon. Voting day, Saturday, 19 is the minimum, maximum of 25, cloudy, with a very high chance of showers, most likely in the morning and afternoon. Winds southerly, 15 to 20 kilometres, turning southeasterly, 15 to 25 kilometres during the morning. And then on Sunday, it should be partly cloudy, with a high chance of showers and light winds, a minimum of 19 and a maximum of 25. Now, if you store that piece in the Sydney Morning Herald by David Sellers, I thought it was so impressive. He's a guy from Oberon, that lovely town, and he's a local footballer. And he just talked about playing football and being concussed a lot. He's not a professional, playing local football. He talks very engagingly about Oberon and how it's the thing to do. If you're a bloke there, you join the footy team, and he loves it. Still does it. But that he's been concussed a number of times. He estimates between 40 and 50 times during his sporting career. Most of the symptoms were mild, just noticeable enough to recognise that they were there. He's had about 30 fights as an amateur boxer, as well as his rugby league career, if career is the right word, rugby league practice. And he just talks about the impact of this. He says on the vivid thing he starts with, he says on 2 occasions he's had police at the doorstep. And he's obviously a very honest bloke. Why the police turned up on his doorstep twice. They have wanted to know whether he filled his car with petrol without paying. And both times he said, no, of course, ridiculous, no, of course not. But they had footage from the previous day, in both cases, of this chap using the Bowser, hopping back behind the wheel and just driving off. He tried to remember it, but he couldn't. It was just a blur. And it's obviously an impact of his concussion. The last time he was concussed, the trainer came onto the field and said, "Come on, you got to get off the new rules." And he said, "I fought him to keep playing. It sounds stupid, even after I've been forced off, but I would have gone back if they'd have allowed me." And then he says, "As players, we need saving from ourselves." He says on that occasion, what scared him most was when he got home. For about 24 hours, he had short-term memory loss. "I forgot I had a fiancée, and I forgot that I was expecting a child." Now, it lasted for 24 hours. After that, the memory, the understanding came back. But, gee, it's a good piece. And he just talks about his personal experience. And then he says, look, for those of you who are questioning the NRL's new protocols, forget it. They are long, long overdue. And I just thought it was such an impressive young guy to write this piece, to, admit all these things, but to help us with our understanding of what concussion really means. In terms of somebody who's played and enjoyed and still plays rugby league. It's currently 13 minutes to 5 here on ABC Radio Sydney. 1300 222 702. On the text 0467 922 702. Were you with us yesterday when we talked to that lovely woman who organises dates and marriages within the Indian community here in Sydney? She's a a matchmaker within that community. And so we got out all the songs, partly because she talked about that idea of perfection and the fact that sometimes people come to her with this long list of requirements. You know, the man or the woman must be this, and this. And she has to quietly sort of go through and say, well, you know, sometimes you just have to shorten your list of absolute requirements. And we talked about that idea of the one and whether there's only one person, that destiny, you know, that whole Disney princess idea, or prince idea. There's one person on this planet that is meant for you. Is that true? Well, we played a couple of songs, that lovely Flight of the Conchords song yesterday, but here's the other one which lots of people mentioned, and yeah, it's a perfect expression of the idea that love is true and love is glorious. But as Tim Minchin says, if I didn't have you, well, yesterday suggested we play it, so there you go. Let's check the traffic.
ABC Radio Sydney traffic.
Actually, it's not too bad at the moment. We've got at Waterfall, McKell Avenue between Lady Wakehurst Drive and the Vehicle Trail. Some slow traffic in both directions, but that's the only thing at the moment. If you've got anything else, 1300 222 702 here on ABC Radio Sydney. If you want to text, of course, 0467 922 702 as we find out about the day in sport. And it's Patrick Stack, host of the ABC Sport Daily podcast, which joins the World Wide Web about now each day. Good afternoon.
G'day, Richard.
Cool story about snow sports.
Yeah, that's right. So Danielle Scott is quite an interesting story. She was a gymnast. Like a lot of these aerial skiers in Australia, they tend to come through the gymnastic ranks. Basically, at a certain point, they're sort of identified as not quite having the chops to make it as gymnasts. But the way that the Australian Olympic Committee is set up, they're like, we know that you can make it as an aerial skier. So she goes into aerial skiing and does really well. Like goes to the 2018 Olympics. They're hoping that there might be big things. Doesn't quite work out. Goes to 2022 in Beijing. They're like, this is her time, her moment to get a medal. Finishes 10th. Has all these sort of internal conversations with herself. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Like, it's time to chuck it in. I'm on the other side of 30 now. Like, what's going on? She takes a moment to pause, regathers herself and goes back into it. And she's just finished the World Cup series and picked up the Crystal Globe for the best aerial skier on the planet after winning 3 of the events for the year. And
what is the Crystal Globe? That's a good thing,
it's
isn't
a
it?
beautiful, big Crystal Globe, as the name would suggest. And so she's actually ended up winning the thing. Laura Peel's come in second. And she's spoken to ABC Sport Daily today about the sort of intersection of that moment of serious doubt and then having to sort of rail against that and steel herself to sort of go again, knowing that she's 4 years away from another Olympic opportunity. She's never won a World Cup series, albeit she's won a couple of events. So a fantastic feel-good story, and well done to Danielle Scott, who is celebrating somewhere on the northern beaches today after flying home on a number of planes from Kazakhstan. She says that she wants to have a bonfire somewhere.
Good.
And enjoy herself.
I hope it's a snow globe, by the way. Now, a big Australian name retires from surfing.
That was good, Richard.
Thank you.
Owen Wright. Owen Wright has announced he's going to step away from surfing after the Bells Beach Pro. So Owen Wright is a fantastic story as well of himself. He suffered a serious brain injury a number of years ago and looked like he was going to be lost to the world of surfing for good. Again, a classic in adversity, sort of fights his way back, manages to get to an Olympics and win a bronze medal at the first time that particular sport has featured at an Olympic Games in Japan. So a history made by Owen Wright, one of the absolute good guys of not only Australian surfing but Australian sport. He has basically concerns about concussion and wants to mitigate any ongoing dangers that he might have been facing. And he's just saying that increasingly, the world of pro surfing is getting bolder and bolder. They're pushing the boundaries more and more in waves like Chopu, Pipeline. The waves can't be getting any bigger, but the capacity to ride those waves is. So surfers are taking off deeper in the wave, in heavier conditions, and are getting more and more adept at pushing the boundaries. But what that means is that the rate of concussion, the risk of concussion, climbs and climbs. So Owen Wright said, look, no surfer retires from the pastime. Like, it's something that's with you until the day you die, basically. So he's going to keep surfing, but just not in hectic waves anymore. So
yeah, good on him, because as we know, it's serious. Now, in the cricket, the Sheffield Shield final starts tomorrow.
Yeah, sadly, New South Wales won't be taking part. I think they've had one of their worst seasons on record, but Western Australia will be taking on Victoria. It is going to be a heck of a final taking place over in Perth. WA missing a host of stars: Cam Green, Josh Inglis, Mitch Marsh, Marcus Stoinis, Ashton Agar, all still in India taking part in the one-day international series, which wraps up tonight when Australia do battle with India to see who can claim that series. They're going to take on Victoria, who have got to try and figure out a way to fit in Todd Murphy and Pete Hanscom, who did so well in that test series with India. They'll come back into that side. It's going to be interesting to see how we go. Western Australia have gone from being pretty sort of middling in recent years. They've always been good in the T20 format to absolutely dominating the state cricket stage. They have the BBL, which is the T20 league. They have the one-day international comp sorted out, domestic comp sorted out, and the Sheffield Shield, they've got last year's locked away. If they can win this one, that would be what they say in boxing parlance is unifying the belts, Richard.
Unifying the belts. Oh, may it be the case. Patrick, we'll see you tomorrow, but thank you so much.
Cheers.
Pat Stack, the ABC Sport Daily podcast, out about now. After the news, the Premier and his wife and that call to the Health Minister, Ashley Raper, with the latest in the election news as the Premier denies that he was seeking special advantage for an unwell wife. It is 5:01 here on ABC Radio Sydney.
On Saturday. New South Wales votes.
I do think there's a stark difference when you compare Dom Perrottet and Chris Minns.
Hear from the parties.
People who are really struggling to put food on the table.
The experts.
We are in a cost of living crisis.
And the voters across Sydney.
The parties really need to pay attention to us.
The issues that matter to you.
The chronic teacher shortages.
Inequality. Responsible economic management.
New South Wales votes. Right here.
On ABC Radio Sydney.
Now, John says, what is it with the weather reports? Why do they say high chance of rain tomorrow, mostly in the morning and afternoon? What are the other options? Well, I suppose it could be the evening, couldn't it, or overnight? Well, anyway, there is going to be quite a lot of rain around this week. Coming up, lots of things, including a really interesting Self-Improvement Wednesday about robbery and the world of the orchid. That's ahead, but let's take some news first. On ABC Radio Sydney, it's news time. That's 5 o'clock.
Good afternoon, Adam Story with ABC News. The group tasked with providing advice to the government about the upcoming referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament will meet with the Prime Minister later tonight. The First Nations Referendum Working Group has met on several occasions discussing the timing of the vote, the constitutional amendment and the actual question. The government is waiting on that advice, which it needs before it can finalise legislation that will be introduced to Parliament next week. The Referendum Working Group member, Professor Megan Davis, has confirmed that a meeting will occur tonight to discuss the finer details.
Tonight, members of the Referendum Working Group will meet with the Prime Minister, Minister Burney, Senator Dodson, Senator McCarthy and the Attorney-General. We are so close to finalising our advice so that the government can introduce the constitutional alteration bill into Parliament next week.
Police say they expect further arrests to be made after a confrontation erupted between LGBTQI activists and hundreds of people gathered outside a church in southwestern Sydney. A group of 10 activists were protesting outside St Michael's Church in Belfield yesterday evening when One Nation New South Wales leader Mike Latham was due to speak. Police say a number of glass bottles and other projectiles were thrown at officers as they attempted to shield the protesters from the group. Superintendent Sheridan Walu says 2 men were charged with encouraging the commission of crimes and assault.
This type of violence is not to be tolerated by New South Wales Police, and we've commenced an investigation into the incident. So far there has been 2 persons charged as a result of the incident, and we are reviewing numerous amounts of footage and expect further charges to be laid today against a number of other offenders.
The company Latitude Financial has uncovered further evidence of large-scale data theft that's impacting past and present customers. Amelia Terzon has the details.
Latitude Financial has confirmed the hack on its systems this month is worse than it originally had thought it was. We already knew that around 330,000 customers had had their data leaked. We know that the majority of that, according to Latitude, is people's driver's licences, but also there's been information like Medicare cards and credit cards also hacked. They haven't actually got a number for us yet on how many more customers in that original group have been impacted. They also haven't said yet what sorts of extra data they think has been leaked.
NRL player Francis Molo has avoided a criminal conviction after pleading guilty to a domestic violence offence. Tim Fernandez reports.
Last month, Francis Molo pleaded guilty to 1 count of intimidation over an incident at his home in December last year. He faced Port Kembla Court today, where he was sentenced to an 18-month conditional release order, but avoided a criminal conviction. As part of his release, the Dragons player is prohibited from assaulting, stalking, harassing or intimidating the victim or destroying her property. The property has also been banned from approaching the victim for at least 12 hours after drinking alcohol or taking drugs. The NRL says it will review the court findings and consider its response under the league's rules.
Residents of Menindee in the state's far west are awaiting results of water quality testing after a mass fish kill that has locals concerned their tap water could be unsafe to drink. Millions of native fish were found floating down the Darling River system last week, with the clean-up beginning earlier today. Local authorities have confirmed the overall scale and size of the kill has eclipsed similar events in the area that occurred in 2018 and 2019. Water samples are being flown to Sydney tonight to be tested for heavy metals and pesticides. Market analysts say all eyes will be on the US later tonight when the Federal Reserve makes its latest interest rate decision. The cash rate is widely expected to go up by 1/4 of a percentage point and comes amid 2 banking failures that have raised fears about the health of the financial system. The collapses follow a sharp rise in global borrowing costs led by the US, which has shocked the world economy and raised worries about a recession. CommSec market analyst Steve Daglian says there could be a shift in the US central bank's approach over the coming months, similar to Australia.
The Fed in the US starts to talk down, further rate hikes in the coming months. That could be seen perhaps as a positive and another catalyst for some improvement.
And the local market ended high. The ASX 200 has gained 0.8%. The dollar is also higher. It's at 66.7 US. Showers and possible thunderstorms in many parts of the state tomorrow, more frequent across central and southern parts. For Sydney, an overnight low of 18, followed by a partly cloudy day, but with a high chance of showers and a top of 28.
You're listening to Drive with Richard Glover
on ABC Radio Sydney.
G'day, hope you're well. Rich Glover with you on ABC Radio Sydney. Today, police call out mob violence against rights activists after a church speech delivered by One Nation's Mark Latham. Also today...
Everybody hurts sometimes.
The glory and the problems of being highly empathetic. That's our topic for midweek conference at 5:30. Sarah Edelman will be here. And the woman who has set a new standard for selling clothes that are plastic-free and compostable. You'll meet her. It's all ahead here on ABC Radio Sydney, on radio at 7:02 a.m, on the ABC Listen app, on digital radio, on TV's Channel 25, and of course online everywhere. Well, the New South Wales Premier, Dominic Perrottet, has denied he was asking for special treatment when he called Health Minister Brad Hazzard for advice when his wife required medical care. Although it does seem that the Ambulance Commissioner, no less, ordered the ambulance that was called to help Dominic Perrottet's wife. So what's the story? Ashley Raper is our ABC state political reporter. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Richard.
Where's this suddenly come from a few days before the election?
Well, that's just it. It's made its way into the public arena and just a few days out from the election. And it has put the Premier under pressure, and he faced some serious questions about what happened last month over an ambulance call to...
Oh, so it's quite recent, is it?
Yeah, in February.
Right, okay. So his wife's sick, unwell at home, I suppose?
Yeah, so the Premier detailed it today that she came home from the gym, she'd hurt herself, she'd hurt her back, and he said that he then left for work. He's in the thrust of the campaign. He had an event. He says that he called her after the event. By then, she was in a lot of pain. She was paralysed in bed, in tears. Now, at that point, he decided not to call 000.
Himself, yeah.
Instead, he called the Health Minister, Brad Hazzard. Now, his justification for calling Brad Hazzard is that he says Brad is his friend, and he was unsure what to do because he thought he was going to organise a physio. The Premier says that he was thinking about calling a GP or whether she would go to hospital, and he said...
But Brad's not a doctor, is he?
Well, no, and that was a question that was put to him, why call Brad? But he said, look, Brad Hazzard, the Health Minister, has been around as the Minister for a number of years. Now,
Well, my wife has written medical drama. Doesn't mean you'd get her to look at your rash.
Well, what happened was that Brad Hazzard says that he was in a meeting with the Ambulance Commissioner.
What, in his car or something?
No, in a meeting room.
An office,
so
okay.
in an office, that it was a pre-arranged meeting. So when the Premier called, he just...
Answered the phone, yeah. Okay.
Answered the phone. He spoke to the Premier, and then the Premier says he put him on speaker and said, I've got the Ambulance Commissioner here, and then that there was another senior physician there as part of the meeting, and they discussed what was going on with the Premier's wife. Dominic Perrottet says that they then advised him to go home, and then an ambulance was organised. Now, a statement has been released by New South Wales Ambulance saying that the Commissioner did order that ambulance. He put in the call, but said that in this statement, they said there was no request was made from the Commissioner to prioritise this ambulance, and it was categorised as a priority 2.I, which is the one down from the priority 1. So it's a non-urgent. And the Premier says that an ambulance arrived 40 to 50 minutes later. Now, subsequently, the Premier says he didn't know, but the Premier's wife's sister had been called to the house because she was there. The Premier's wife was in bed, and she had at around the same time called an ambulance as well. Now, only one arrived, so the timeline is so not totally clear.
Do we know the one arrived? Do we know who called it? I suppose is the question.
Yeah. Well, there were 2 calls made, and one ambulance arrived.
All right. So he said that they all say, it sounds like, that had the Premier rung himself, it would have arrived at the same time and in the same order. But I guess the question is why he didn't say, look, thank you very much for the advice. That's very good of you. I'll now ring an ambulance.
Well, yes. And why not just call 000, which the Premier had addressed. Now, the response from the Labor leader, Chris Minns, has been interesting. He's saying he takes it on face value that there was no special treatment. And then he said he doesn't know what he'd do in that situation. He actually repeated that twice within the press conference. You know, what do you do in that situation, you know, when you're panicked for your wife? So Labor does not want to politicise this particular situation.
Look, maybe, I don't know what the public thinks about this, but maybe they think that, you know, most people think that to lose your judgment perhaps to a tiny degree when it's your wife's health is an understandable fault.
Well, look, this will be very fresh in voters' minds when they go to the polls, and you know, Labor is taking a step back clearly and letting the voters make up their own judgment on this. Now, there has been 2 responses from the unions because this does coincide with paramedics taking action. They're dropping patients off. It's and defying health protocol that you have to stay with the patient until the hospital takes charge. For low risk patients, they're essentially leaving them in waiting rooms. So the Paramedics Association has come out and they're asking for clarity on the Premier's call and whether it was put through the appropriate triaging and dispatch procedures. So they're going down that track. Now, the Health Services Union is taking a different tact, and they've condemned, they say, this breach of privacy and that the private health information of politicians' families should never be politicised. So that came from the Health Services Union. Well,
I've only got one response from a listener, and it says, honestly, Richard, this story is much ado about nothing. Who cares about any of it? So maybe that will be the majority view. Maybe we won't. We don't know. We can just report the story as it has come in. Ashley, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Of course, the other big story today is this protest that was held outside a church in Belfield. It was last night. There were these, really quite shocking scenes outside St Michael's Church in Belfield, where Mark Latham from One Nation was holding an event. There were around 10 members of the Community Action for Rainbow Rights. They were holding a peaceful protest when 250 people violently confronted them. And, you know, the word violently comes not from me, but from the police who were there trying to control the situation. Superintendent Sheridan Waldo from Campsie Police spoke this morning about what happened.
The police were only notified of the event a few days prior, and we worked with the event organisers and the protest group to ensure that this was going to be a peaceful event. We had no indication that there would be any violence at the incident. We did have a number of police resources on the scene, and we had been at the scene since 5 p.m, with the event to commence at 7 p.m. We did not expect 250 people to come from that event and have a violent confrontation in the street.
There's Superintendent Sheridan Waldo from Campsie Police. Hosnia Shams is our ABC reporter and joins us on the line. Hosnia, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Richard.
Yeah, can you give us a sense of what happened last night?
Yeah, so Richard, as you mentioned, a group of around 10 members of the Community Action for Rainbow Rights group had gathered outside St Michael's Church in Belfield last night. Now, they were protesting a speech by a New South Wales One Nation leader, Mark Latham, that was due to take place at an event in the church. Now, that event was promoted as a religious freedom and parental rights event. Police say things turned violent when around 250 people who were attending this event turned on the protesters. They say bottles and rocks were hurled at the group of LGBTQI plus activists. A 38-year-old man was allegedly pushed to the ground and assaulted. Riot police had to be called in to disperse the crowd. Now, there's also video on social media that shows police attempting to shield this group of protesters from the crowd. Now, police say it was all under control after about half an hour, and they have charged two men aged 34 and 41. One was charged with encouraging the commission of crimes and the other with assault. Police say they do expect further charges will be laid against others as they continue their investigations. Richard? Yeah,
it certainly does look very violent on that video. There a lot of people swinging, aren't there?
Yeah, right. And Mark Latham has come out and condemned the violence. He says any violence at a political meeting is unfortunate and appropriate to be condemned. But he says the protesters were blocking the road and, in his words, triggered this sort of reaction. Now, Premier Dominic Perrottet has also responded and reacted to this incident. He's described it as disgraceful and says there's no place for violence in New South Wales. Now, police are calling on anyone with more information to come forward, Richard, as they continue their investigation.
Now, you mentioned what Mark Latham had to say. What about the other sides of politics?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Richard, Premier Dominic Perrottet has condemned the violence, as has Labor leader Chris Minns. Now, the independent member for Sydney, Alex Greenwich, has also spoken out. He said he's, in his words, described Mark Latham as a disgusting human being, and people who are considering voting for One Nation need to realise they're voting for an extremely hateful and dangerous individual. These are his words. He said words and hate cause a great deal of damage, and it's really incumbent on political leaders to call this out and to show support for the LGBTQI plus community. So some strong words from Alex Greenwich there in response to this incident, Richard, but surely more to come out as police continue their investigation.
Yep, it sounds like there's more police work to be done. Hosnia, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Richard.
Hosnia Shams, our ABC reporter. It's currently 16 minutes past 5. We'll check the traffic in a second. The business of the ambulance, does it matter? Is it important or not important? As I say, that's a judgment for not for us, but for the voters. I'm sorry, what a beat-up, says Steve in Pymble. People do whatever they can when their loved ones are sick. And Sue agrees with that. Come on, ABC, stop making a mountain out of a molehill. Everybody tries their best to do what they can to help an ill family member. I don't think we're making a mountain out. We're just telling you what has happened today. It's the big story everywhere, so we don't censor it. We don't try to tell you what to think about it, but we also don't keep it off the airways. I think that would be wrong. Denise, a nurse, says, no, Premier, don't ring an ambulance for back pain from the gym unless comorbidities are involved. It's a bad precedent. Go to a GP or a physio chiropractor. Our ambulances and emergency departments are under enough pressure. That's from Denise, a nurse. And Lynette says, why didn't the Premier just ring 000 like the rest of us have to do and wait an hour, as I had to do recently? That's from Lynette. It's 16 minutes past 5 here on ABC Radio Sydney. 1300 222 702. On the text 0467 922 702. Traffic next.
ABC Listen.
So, what's the craziest question you've ever been asked on the Dr. Karl podcast?
Well, Triple J listeners are pretty imaginative, so we've been asked questions like, why do men have nipples?
And what happens if you shoot a gun in space? And how do trees talk to each other? The answer, of course, is the Wood Wide Web.
Karl.
Dr. Karl and Dr. Lucy have all the answers on the Dr. Karl podcast. Find it on the ABC Listen app.
Oh, yeah, just another couple, again, on both sides of this. Sylvia says, my mate fell while playing basketball last week, fractured his skull and bleeding on the brain. He waited 12 hours in the ambulance bay overnight before he got into ER. So if Dom is getting priority, then it is an issue. Although, as Ashley explained, the view from the ambulance commissioner was there was no particular priority given. So take that into account. What else? Did she cut her fingers too? Call the bloody ambo yourself, says someone. But they go on. On the other hand, I always call in medical favours if I need to. So there's a view from people that, whether you agree with it or not, it's what people would do. You'd sort of do anything for your loved ones. Maybe that's the majority view. It's 18 minutes past 5 here on ABC Radio Sydney. Are you one of our regular students for Self-Improvement Wednesday? Each week you get to learn something new. Your lesson this week, Perth's Orchard Thieves. The teacher is Professor Kingsley Dixon, John Curtin, Distinguished Professor in Botany at Curtin University. Kingsley, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Richard.
Now, let me introduce this with a bit of a news clip, because people might remember the news. It was just last month when up to 900 specimens of rare orchids were stolen from Kings Park in Perth.
These conservation garden beds were home to hundreds of the state's rarest orchids. Now they're bare, dug up in a brazen theft.
Somebody had come in, taken the tubers, they're dormant, so they knew what they're looking for, and then it happened the following night again.
The stolen plants are unlikely to survive.
Our Perth district is investigating that matter at the moment. Very early days still in terms of the information that's on hand.
Individuals caught with rare plants face fines of up to $500,000.
Yeah, there's our ABC report from last month. Kingsley, you know these orchids personally, don't you?
They're two that I've worked on for about the last 22 years because they're rare, and particularly one of them, the carbon-up spider orchid, is quite the glamour girl of orchids, but only has 280 plants left in the wild.
And I'm guessing it's very hard to take it from the wild and repropagate it in these circumstances.
So there's an interesting twist to this story, because all of those plants were actually put into public open display and tagged and all the rest of it, so people could actually see this material. But all of them were propagated from seed generated in the glasshouses from material that, in some cases, like the collie spider orchid, which was the second species, was grown from seed in the first place. So the material was artificially propagated, and then those plants were then put in those display gardens to start to understand how you might move them back into bushland habitats, at the same time providing people with wonderful educational opportunity. But sadly, that went a bit sour.
So not only do you lose the plants, but I guess you lose some of the science of what you were learning about that reintroduction.
Yeah, the good news in this very grim story is that these orchids, like all of our orchids, and spider orchids in particular, they produce a seed capsule, and the seed capsule can have more than 10,000 wonderful little viable dust-like seeds. So you can quickly get the number of plants back. It just takes you about 2 to 3 years, and then you've got to go through the exercise of transplanting them and doing all of that work. So it's a setback, but it's not a fatal blow to the species by a long shot.
Now, I suppose to explain this, you've got to go into the world of orchid thieves. I remember there was that famous Susan Orlean non-fiction book about, I think it was set in Florida, about the orchid thieves there. But why is it such a thing?
Oh, look, when the Victorian gardeners got their sticky fingers on the glamorous orchids coming out of South America during what was called the orchid delirium of the 19th century, suddenly orchids, they really became the top plants. You would get people vying to pay the highest price for the exclusivity to get just that brand new species. And these are those, they were called chocolate box orchids because they used to be the flowers shown on chocolate boxes, and they were the classic corsage that was presented to your intended during the wars. But they were always very, very highly priced, and that was until they actually cracked how to propagate them. But orchids have always been under people's skin. They're bewitching, but at the same time, just as orchid delirium, they were getting £1,000 a plant. That's like $500,000 by our standards for some of that South American material in the 1850s. So today there is a very dark black market in orchid, and the rarer the plant, the higher the price.
So where do you think these might have gone? Will they have been sold to locals in Perth? Would they have been exported overseas? What would have happened to them, do you think?
So I know the orchid community very well here in Perth. I know most of the orchid people across Australia, particularly in native orchids. Anyone who had in their collection one of those two species would be conspicuous. So you can be a collector, but what does a collector want to do when he needs to show his collection? So they clearly hadn't gone into private collections, particularly that number, and they would have been probably swiftly packaged up, stuck in a suitcase, and either taken into the Southeast Asian black orchid market or into the European market, remembering that these little dormant tubers, which are about as big as your little fingernail, would be getting $100 to $150 a tuber. So you'd multiply that by 900. So the prize was a potentially big one. And it's interesting, we're all doing spot searches on the web to see when this material comes up for sale, because then most countries have signed an international treaty where you can't trade in endangered orchids. So the moment they appear, there will be all sorts of Interpol action to get those orchids recovered, repatriated, or get those people suitably punished.
And how much chance is that the orchids will survive? Will they, is it possible that they'll just die without, a proper careful hand like yours?
These would be going into highly specialised collectors and collections, and they probably already have some pretty sophisticated techniques. I've been privy during this whole expose to people showing me photographs of some collections in European glass houses, in private collections, and I must say some of their culture of Australian and West Australian orchids has been quite extraordinary. So probably they will survive, probably the majority being spider orchids and a bit fussy, probably won't survive.
Wow. So tell me about your own feelings, Kingsley, having been, lovingly propagated these things. What did you feel, when you were, I don't know whether it was the next day, whenever you were called in and saw what had happened?
Well, I was gobsmacked. I couldn't believe it, and I couldn't believe the audacity of the crime. That's why, this has been carefully planned, military-style precision, because these are in open beds in full public view. You wouldn't do it at night because you'd need lights and you'd be very visible with headlights and other stuff going. So it's the audaciousness of the whole thing, and then disbelief. But after you get over that, you then say, well, the Botanic Gardens will soldier on and put what will be their stored seed, put that into new culture and begin the whole process again. And next time around, have a public display, but probably something that has a bit more security.
Yeah, but what
highly valued.
What a shame that you have to put things behind, effectively bars of some kind. Kingsley Dixon is here, and how long will it take to get you back to where you were before this happened?
So the Botanic Gardens, it'll probably take about 5 years to get to that stage. So it's a setback of half a decade. But, it's a setback that's disappointing because, as we all know, we're looking at a biodiversity crisis across the continent, drying climates, extreme weather events, and orchids really sit at the leading edge of all of those catastrophic impacts. They're almost like the pit canary of telling us how our ecosystems are travelling. And as a result, orchids are the most endangered plant group that we've got in the country, and for good reason. They're very complex. They have complex interactions. So it's sad to have the setback, because we could have been learning things a little ahead of the curve. And with things such as the carbon up spider orchid, with just 280 plants left, time is running out for it. So every learning is an important part to stop extinction.
Yeah, what an awful tale, and just good luck to you and the attempt to get back where you were. Kingsley, thank you so much for the lesson.
It's a pleasure, Richard. Thank you.
There's a Kingsley Dixon. John Curtin, Distinguished Professor in Botany at Curtin University, with his Self-Improvement Wednesday on Perth's orchid thieves. You can listen again online, of course, abc.net.au/Sydney. And next week, Dr. Jodie Rowley will be here for Self-Improvement Wednesday, frog expert from the Australian Museum. That's Self-Improvement Wednesday next week. Let's check the traffic.
ABC Radio Sydney traffic.
And Jeff Wallace is here from the Australian Traffic Network. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Richard. Anzac Bridge and my TMC cameras reside the CBD, Darling Harbour, across the main deck in towards Rozelle, with Lane Cove Road, North Ryde, sawing past the M2, all the way down through Top Ryde onto the Ryde Bridge. Seven Hills, Station Road, slow, well, very, very slow, off the Prospect Highway down towards Fitzwilliam Road, and Campbelltown, the Relton Road, slowing across the Hume, westbound in towards Mount Annan. I'm Jeff Wallace from the Australian Traffic Network.
Jeff, thank you very much. Adam Story with the news headlines in a tick. We've also got Tom Saunders with the weather. Yeah, just the last little bit of commentary on the ambulance situation. Is it a minor story that doesn't matter? The fact that the ambulance commissioner rang the ambulance for the Premier's wife, just him, a husband doing what anybody would do, or is it a significant thing for you? A range of views, as usual. John says, if the Commissioner is saying he knew the Premier's wife needed an ambulance but she didn't get priority treatment, I call it bull, he says. John says, Premier has no respect for us paramedics, but when he panics, he calls us. That's from John. Another says, if we weren't in the ambulance ramping situation, it wouldn't be such a big deal, but we are, so it is. From the other side, seriously, so much beat up about the ambulance issue, so trivial, a waste of valuable broadcast time. That one doesn't give me a name. From Mel, he should have called Health Assist, 1-800 number for after-hours triage. I care for an 88-year-old with comorbidities and always call them before I call an ambulance. But again, from the other side, people are so mean. I think Dom did what he had to do. It's his wife. And Jim, again, this flips back to the other side. He says, it's understandable. But still, it's one rule for the elites and a different rule for the plebs. Tom with the weather in a second, but Adam Story with the news headlines first. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Richard. The group tasked with providing advice to the government about the Voice to Parliament referendum says it's very close to finalising its guidance. The group has been meeting to consider the timing of the referendum, refining the proposed constitutional amendment and the actual question. Australians are being assured there will be proper consultation about where nuclear waste will eventually be stored under the AUKUS submarine project. Concerns and questions have been raised within Labor about how radioactive material will be disposed of once the future nuclear-powered boats are decommissioned. The US Central Bank is tipped to raise interest rates by 0.25 percentage point later tonight. The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is facing intense scrutiny amid turbulence in global financial markets. And train services have now resumed across Greece for the first time since the deadly rail disaster 3 weeks ago that left 57 people dead. At least 9 people remain in hospital with serious injuries. More ABC News at 6.
Adam, thank you. Tom Saunders with the weather. Good afternoon.
Richard, good afternoon.
What's today brought?
Well, it's been a gloomy kind of day in Sydney. We've hit 24 for a maximum. Most suburbs have only seen a couple of sprinkles, but we do have some showers right now on the radar through the western suburbs and also down near the airport. That activity will continue over the next few hours, and there's still the slight chance of a storm today. We've had some big rain through the central west of the state. Orange has had 50 millimetres today.
Mm-hmm. Now, tomorrow.
Well, we'll have humid northeasterly winds tomorrow. There's the chance of fog tomorrow morning and then a very high chance of showers, most likely in the afternoon and the evening. There's the chance of thunderstorms tomorrow and they could be severe. Damaging winds and large hail are possible, and there's an outside chance we'll see some flash flooding. Warmer than today, 19 to 28, the temperature range in the city, 26 for the beaches tomorrow and up to 29 in the west.
Okay, Friday and then, of course, voting day, Saturday.
Yeah, so the wet spell will continue. Again, on Friday, it will be cloudy. There's a high chance of showers and storms. The cooler southerly change, we drop to 26 degrees. Now, Saturday's voting day, but you probably need your umbrella. Showers and storms. Heavy falls are possible, particularly very early on Saturday, and perhaps just easing off as we move through the day, but still the risk of showers as we continue into Sunday, although an easing trend continuing there. And then showers also likely through at least the first half of next week, Richard.
Okay, don't put away the raincoat just yet. We'll see on the news. There's Tom Saunders. Midweek conference coming up in just a second, but first let's find out what's on tonight's edition of PM.
David Lipson here on PM at 6:30. Violence outside a Sydney church raising concerns about divisions in society. We'll hear how it's all about a struggle for power rather than any particular rise in religious conservatism. And the government to consider acting early on regulating AI. What guardrails will ensure we enjoy the benefits without the harms?
It is a little worrying how the tech companies seem to be throwing caution to the wind. For the last couple of years, they've been developing careful ethical frameworks and arguing that they can be self-regulated. But in the commercial pressure, we're seeing companies leap in.
Those stories and more coming up on PM at 6:30.
Richard Glover with you on Drive. 26 minutes to 6 is the time. If you want to call us, 1300 222 702, or you can text 0467 922 702. We're going to talk about empathy in a second. I wonder if you think of yourself as an empathetic person. Normally, it's a positive thing in life, isn't it? You think of the people who cry during movies, who take on the emotional travails of people in their life, who understand what they're going through and think about it deeply. The world would be a lot worse a place if it wasn't for empathetic humans who are attuned to the feelings of others. But is there a downside to empathy? I wonder if you're an empathetic person or maybe live with an empathetic person and you can see points where they're not able, for instance, to stand up to somebody. They're too worried about the feelings of the other person. They're too worried about, for instance, the feelings of their boss to insist that they're paid the right money or given the right conditions. They're too empathetic about the feelings of their partner to seek to be treated properly and maybe even to seek a divorce or a separation because the empathy comes out so strongly. I'd love to know whether you've got a view about empathy and the points in which in life it is such a positive thing, but also the points in which you have to kind of almost control your own empathetic urges. 1300 222 702. 1300 222 702. There was an article on the weekend, for instance, in The Good Weekend, which touched on domestic violence. It quoted the mother of the victim talking about how an abusive partner had used her child's empathy and compassion against her. As I say, we normally think of empathy as such a good thing, and yet here was an example of the downside. People with high empathy often have trouble ending relationships, leaving unsatisfying jobs, terminating bad friendships, because they don't want to hurt others, or they think they can help them. Maybe this is chiming with you about yourself or someone you know. 1300 222 702. Sarah Edelman, psychologist and author of Change Your Thinking and No Worries, is a regular guest on Midweek Conference, and she joins us again. Good afternoon.
Hi, Richard.
We normally think of empathy in such positive terms, but it can be a difficult thing in life as well.
Yeah, I guess it's something that's on a continuum, and at one end you've got very low levels of empathy, and that's really not a socially sort of valuable trait. It means people are very focused on their own needs and always looking at how they can benefit. But if you go along that continuum, at the other end is people who have excessive empathy or very high levels of empathy. And while some of their traits are very socially attractive and they're very likeable, it often comes at a personal cost to themselves.
They're high. I mean, sometimes the term is used, empaths, isn't it? They're highly aware of the emotions of others.
Yeah. So someone who we often talk about as being an empath is able to feel or to share in the feelings of others, but also to see things from the other person's perspective. So it's really that capacity to know what it's like to be the other person, to be able to sort of step into their shoes, and also to feel their pain if the other person's suffering.
And this would be particularly intense in your private life, I suppose. You've got a friend who's got breast cancer, to quote some example, and you're absolutely there with her in her shoes. But you'd also get it, I imagine, watching the television news and you see those poor people in Ukraine. And, of course, we all feel sympathetic, but I can imagine someone feeling just so aware of their suffering that they would be almost unable to move.
Yeah, and in fact, for a lot of people, watching what's going on in Ukraine is almost unbearable. It is so sickening and distressing. I guess the thing that really brings out empathy is vulnerable people suffering. So seeing people who are sort of bombed in their own homes, and people fleeing and people suffering. So any sort of situation that involves vulnerable people with high empathy, particularly affected by children who are suffering, because children seem particularly vulnerable. They might get really upset if harm is being done to animals, or if they hear about someone being bullied. So it's all about particularly feeling distressed at the suffering of those who are vulnerable.
Sarah Edelman is with us. Are these descriptions of people with high levels of empathy and the good things and some of the difficulties of that situation, are they chiming with you? We'd love you to call us 1300 222 702, 1300 222 702. I mean, let's talk about the positives first, because the world would be not a very good place if there weren't empathetic people.
Well, in fact, empathy is very good for the world. Part of our genetic makeup is we have an element of selfishness, and that's really helpful in order for each individual to look after their own interests and those of their immediate family. But empathy, on the other hand, is caring not just about your immediate family and people who you know well, but just having feelings for other people. Now, if we all had very high levels of empathy, I think in many ways the world would be a better place. Because we wouldn't have wars, we wouldn't want to hurt other people. We'd care about our neighbours. We would, we'd care about people who are vulnerable, and we might even be happy to pay tax because we'd know that it's really helping other people, and particularly people who are most in need. So my guess is our society would look very differently if everybody had high empathy.
Okay, so that's the positives, and they probably outweigh the negatives. But let's talk about the negatives, because sometimes it can leave you very vulnerable, can't it?
Well, particularly for the individual. I mean, being an empath is great for your friends and people who rely on you and who need your support. People who are empaths are often attracted to the caring professions, so they're likely to be working in jobs like social work or psychology or nursing, or they might be working with disadvantaged groups because they particularly want to support other people. But for the individual themselves, it means that they often are impacted by the pain of others. So they're more likely to get very distressed. They're more likely to feel sad. They're more likely to want to help others, even those that they can't always help. And in personal relationships, they may be willing to put up with and tolerate behaviour that is abusive, or that is unkind, or that is sometimes violent, because on some deep level they still really care about the person. An interesting thing is even abusive people can sometimes be nice, and so people who are very high in empathy often really sort of focus on the nice parts of that person and sort of really don't set boundaries in situations where they really should.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to that in a second. We want to talk obviously about how you can keep the good things about being empathetic without some of the negative things. Obviously, the example that we began with of not being able to leave a domestic violence situation because of the empathy you have for the perpetrator of these crimes. That's an extreme example, but there are sort of lesser examples than that of maybe not being able to sack somebody, one of your employees that needs to be sacked because you're too focused on their pain and not for what has to be done with the business. That might be one example as well. Agreeing to something you don't really want to do, but you're so focused on the other person's needs that you downplay your own. We'll talk about how you can dial these things up and down a little bit with Sarah in a moment. But I wonder if this is all chiming with you. Lynn has rung from the Blue Mountains. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I've been, and I'm almost 70 now, and I'm empathetic, and my daughter is too. And my daughter's just gone through a terrible domestic violence situation, just as you were talking about. And I've told her that she needs to take boundaries. But it was very difficult for her to walk away. She has done now, but it was, very difficult.
And like the case I began with, do you think the perpetrator was almost using your daughter's compassion and empathy against her?
Yes, I think so. And he's also quite narcissistic. So he played on her good nature for a long time. But when it became violent, because it was always coercive and financially abusive and things like that, but when it became violent, she left. And, it got worse.
Yeah, well, good on her for finding that strength, and I'm sure you...
But I found that I can't get too close to what's happening.
Because of your empathy. Yeah, because of your empathy, right?
Yes, and I needed to protect my own mental health.
Yeah, because you feel... Yeah.
So, yes, and I just do a lot of things to help me cope with it. Walking. I had an issue the other day with her. She was suicidal, and she told me sent me a text to say, I'm done, I'm going. And I'm panicking like anything, and she hadn't done it, but it was like,
Yeah, you got it. Well, you got to protect yourself, don't you? Hey, Lynn, thank you so much for talking to us.
You're welcome.
And here's Wendy as well. Hi, Wendy.
Hello, Richard.
You identify with being this highly empathetic person.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, like a lot of personality traits, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. So it gives me great purpose in life and so much joy, and I think it makes me a much kinder person, and then that reflects back at me. So that's a wonderful, wonderful part of my life. But it comes wrapped up with obviously a whole lot of other things. And one thing that's not that I've realised more recently, and it's not really recognised, is that I feel that if you're particularly empathetic, you can process information a lot more deeply. And I find if I need to make a decision, I'm faced with the entire situation, and I worry. I can sort of see all of the consequences of any direction I might take from that decision. You follow the little thread and can see the consequences to that, and perhaps that might affect this person this way, and it just can be paralysing sometimes. And I've learned how to deal with it, but yeah, it's an interesting sort of offshoot, and it does definitely make life complicated.
Okay, you can't say to us, "I've learned how to deal with it," and not tell us how. What's the trick? Do you think?
Yeah. Oh, look. Yes, it's just all very complicated. So I've actually of late realised as well that I identify as not being neurotypical. So I think in today's world you can claim some of these things, and the workplace is much more accepting, and I'm really supported at work, and that difference is embraced, and it's just so wonderful and comforting to have the support and be able to use that as a sort of a superpower rather than a curse. Isn't
that great? The superpower rather than a curse, Wendy. Thank you so much. Claire is here on the text saying, I had to give up my job as a paediatric oncology nurse when I couldn't keep my empathy in check after I had my own child. And I can really imagine that too. Sarah, so let's come to this. Through Wendy and through Claire too, how do you keep the good bits of it, the wonderful bits of it, while trying to control these downsides?
Well, one of the issues with people who are excessively empathic is resistance to change. So really what they're very often following is just an instinct, and that instinct is to care about other people and to, to feel and to support them. And, I guess the first thing is to really understand that the costs, in the case where the costs are greater than the benefits, that you really do want to change. So a lot of it is just really finding the motivation and getting to the point where you realise the costs are too great. And those costs can be things like stress and overwhelm and not being able to sleep and ignoring your own needs. And in some cases, such as I think Lynn's daughter, experiencing abuse and all sorts of other suffering. So recognising that the costs are greater than the benefits, and also just taking a bit of time to work out what is my resistance to change. Why don't I want to sort of let go of some of that extreme behaviour? And sometimes it's a fear that, if I'm not empathic, maybe I'll be uncaring or I'll be an unkind person, or maybe other people will suffer more. So partly it's, it's also to just recognise that you can be kind.
So isn't part of the problem that other people sometimes will suffer more? So, the great example, I think, in this discussion was, or a simple example anyway, is you're a middle manager, and really everyone knows you've got to sack the New South Wales sales manager because he's not doing a good job. And in fact, he's making everyone else's life a misery. You've got to sack him. But you're an empathetic person, right? So he's got 2 kids, and his wife is going to be upset by this, and he's going to be upset by it. So how do you sort of put all that natural empathy you've got to one side and understand that in this case you've got to be cruel?
Look, I think it's not an easy thing to do. It is. It would be distressing for anyone, even those that are not super high on empathy. I guess sometimes we need to look at the greater good or the greater benefit and recognise that if this person isn't able to do a good job, it's affecting other people. It's affecting the organisation, and sometimes that has to be supported as well. But my guess is for most people, almost anybody who's had to sack somebody, especially in a situation where that job is their livelihood, it will come with a degree of pain and heartache and distress, or usually it does. And I think that's part of being human. That it's okay to feel bad when we have to sack somebody, as long as it doesn't sort of then lead to excessive distress or depression or other problems.
Yeah. Sarah Edelman is with us, author of Change Your Thinking and No Worries. We're talking about empathy, obviously a very positive thing in society, but we're talking about some of the points where it becomes a difficulty and how to have the good parts of it if you're empathetic without some of the traps of it. Rebecca is here. Good afternoon, Rebecca. Rebecca.
How are you?
Yeah, good. Good afternoon.
Look, I really feel for your previous callers. I think I have experienced all of the same, and I'm parenting a young child who's very much an empath, and so listening to Lynn's situation sort of strikes the fear of God in you, to what's ahead of you. But at this point in time, trying to provide them with enough space to acknowledge how they are feeling, but equipping them with the tools that they also need on how to get past them.
Now, how does extreme empathy, how does it display itself, if you know what I mean, in a child that's under 10?
It's really, really interesting, and it's the sort of things that they kind of want to bring up with you to discuss, especially if they've had a change in demeanour, and, really easy, especially, busy parenting, to sort of dismiss those concerns as being not important and not something that they need to worry themselves about, but they do worry about it. And so I think, I am totally taken aback by the level of compassion that they have, and I think I've become a kinder parent as a result, and maybe a kinder person in many respects, because I think I've experienced that empathetic burnout, and that has made me quite a different decision maker in many respects. But yes, from a child's perspective, it really does. You have to recalibrate, and you have to think about what are the choices of words that I use to encourage for them to move on, to recognise that it was a difficult situation for their peer who lost their dog, and they must be feeling sad. And what kind of things you could actively do to support them. Because I think almost turning it into an activity or that they can engage with kind of helps them reinforce, yes, it was sad, I can do something about it. If I can't, I'm actually ready to get over it again. But I'm still a work in progress myself, so I can't really offer too much advice.
That sounds pretty wise to me, the idea of activity being a place that they can put all this empathy, all this emotion that they're feeling. Sarah, how do you deal with this when it's an under 10-year-old child who's, feeling the friend's loss of the friend's dog as keenly as if it were his own?
Yeah, look, it's interesting also with Rebecca that, and in fact with some of the other callers as well, that the mother is highly empathic and so is the child. And that seems to be a really common pattern that, maybe there's a genetic or learned sort of behaviour, but it often does run in families. It's also interesting that even at the age of 2, even toddlers show some degree of empathy. So if they see, for example, another toddler in creche crying, they might sort of go to them and try and give them a toy or try to console them in some way. So it can be a real instinct. But look, for young people, I thought Rebecca's suggestion is terrific. What can you actively do to support them? Also talking to her child and saying, look, there are some things we can change and there are some things that we can't. And we need to sort of learn that it's okay, that sometimes it's okay just to, just to be kind to that person, or just to say, I'm sorry you've lost your dog, or to just have some sort of basic symbol of support, and that's enough. Some of it is just, I guess talking to your children and making it clear that we can't fix things for everybody. And sometimes people do go through difficult times, but they do recover, they do get better, and this person will also get better with time.
Yeah. Sarah Edelman is with us. So is Angie. Good afternoon, Angie.
Oh, hi, Richard. Hi, Sarah. Very interesting conversation. Sarah, what do you think about this? I have a girlfriend who started a very senior position in the political world and unfortunately got diagnosed with a form of cancer. And she has actually gone back to work but is still getting ongoing treatment. That treatment's having some adverse effect on her. Her position was that she didn't want to leave the job because she felt empathy to her very senior, boss. Mm. So she went to the specialist to get, what's the word? Just an ongoing report. And all she wanted to hear from the doctor was, I'm going to give you a letter to say that you can't work anymore, so that the responsibility was taken off her and put on the doctor that she could go then to her very senior boss and say, it's doctor's orders that I can't work.
Yes. In other words, the main thing in her mind was not her own pain but it was the idea that she might be letting down somebody else and creating a problem.
Yeah.
That's a classic example, isn't it, Sarah?
Yeah, it is. And in fact, one of the comments that someone made about her own daughter, who's an empath, is she can't leave. She has real trouble leaving. She can't leave relationships. She can't leave jobs. She can't leave. It's almost like she worries about the consequences, and worrying about letting down the team or especially when you're doing a good job or an important job, is a real common downside of being an empath. And yes, sometimes it's really helpful when others intervene and say, sorry, you can't do this. I mean, in this case, with the doctor's orders, I think that's that's particularly helpful. But sometimes, members of the family need to step in, or other people need to step in and say, look, really, it's not okay. This is the point. I can see what, this is having a negative effect on you, and I'm going to sort of be really asking you very strongly to step down, or to take a backward step given your situation.
To look after yourself. Exactly. Ross is here. Hi, Ross.
Oh, hi, Richard and Sarah. How are you doing?
Yeah, and empathy and the sort of we know about the positives, but I guess the difficulties of it.
Yeah, it's a bit of an epiphany for me hearing that today, because I've always considered myself a fairly empathic person. I work in rehabilitation as a rehab counsellor with people who've had quite serious injuries, and I have to obviously have a lot of empathy in terms of understanding where they're at and how I can support them. But as a parent, of a child who's, finished high school and just doesn't know what to do with themselves, has trouble getting up out of bed every day, doesn't know what to do in terms of a job. It's hard trying to have that balance of understanding them and trying to support them, but also having some boundaries to establish, what I think is really going to be important for them and helpful for them in terms of, having a reason to get out of bed, for instance, and having a purpose to the day, and also just having some boundaries if I feel they're not pulling their weight.
Yeah. So how to get that toughness when the other side of you is kind of living
when I'm
in there.
My balance, I'm a bit imbalanced in terms of probably, I have to sort of really push myself to have, having a bit of a harder sort of side to me as well. So.
Yeah, so interesting. And you've got it at work and at home, the double situation. Ross, thank you so much. Here's Danny on the text. Sorry? Sorry, 2 minutes to 6 is the time. This is on the text from Danny, a highly empathetic psychologist working with traumatised children. I think she's describing herself here. It's like walking on a knife edge. Self-awareness, boundaries and self-care are so important. And Sarah, that's, I guess, takes us right back to the beginning, doesn't it? That there are times in your life where the focus shouldn't be on the other person. It should be actually on saving yourself.
And that's what balance is all about. I mean, it's fine to be a compassionate person, and if you're working with people who are suffering, it's reasonable to have empathy for them, but also focusing on your own needs and practicing some self-compassion, recognising that your needs, your emotions, your feelings are important as well.
Good on you, Sarah. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who shared their stories. It's 1 minute to 6, lots coming up on Drive, but first, today's announcement.
Here is a broadcast by Mark Latham for the Pauline Hanson's One Nation for the New South Wales state election.
G'day, I'm Mark Latham, leader of New South Wales One Nation. Whether we're talking about school education or the rising cost of living, our political leaders have lost touch with common sense. One Nation believes in getting our schools back to basics, with evidence-based literacy and numeracy instead of political indoctrination. We want an electricity grid with flourishing coal, gas and nuclear power to bring down energy costs, helping your household budget. Labor, Liberal and Nationals have put all their eggs in the renewables basket, costing billions to rebuild the entire electricity system. That's why your bills are going through the roof. You know, the Labor Party looks like winning this election in the lower house, but in the upper house, One Nation will stop the worst of the Labor Green policies, like drug legalisation and gender fluidity teaching in schools. We're an effective insurance policy against the left wing going too far. Vote 1 for One Nation. We're fighting the major party madness.
Authorised by Neil Turner for the Pauline Hanson's One Nation Cessnock. Spoken by Mark Latham.
It's 6 o'clock. Good evening. Adam Story with ABC News. The First Nations Referendum Working Group providing guidance on the voice to Parliament says it's close to providing final advice to the government. Here's political reporter Stephanie Boris in Canberra.
The group, which includes representatives from First Nations communities across the country, has been tasked with providing advice to government on how to try to ensure the referendum is successful. They've been considering the timing of the referendum, refining the proposed constitutional amendment and the framing of the question. Member Megan Davis says progress has been made.
We are so close to finalising our advice.
But time is running out. The government needs the advice to finalise the Constitution alteration bill that it wants to introduce to Parliament next week. The group will meet with the Prime Minister this evening.
The federal government has rejected an amendment to include social media in the advertising blackout period ahead of the referendum. Independent Senator David Pocock had wanted the traditional media blackout period applying to television, radio and newspapers extended to social media platforms. Special Minister of State Don Farrell says the purpose of the bill is to modernise the referendum to feel like a general federal election, which does not include a social media ban. But David Pocock says the ban would help avoid issues of transparency closer to the vote.
Social media now is a very legitimate advertising channel. In fact, millions and millions of dollars are spent on social media advertising. It just seems common sense to bring this up to date.
Australians are being assured there'll be proper consultation about where nuclear waste will eventually be stored under the AUKUS submarine project. Concerns and questions have been raised within Labor about how radioactive material will be disposed of once future nuclear-powered boats are decommissioned. Defence Minister Richard Marles has told Parliament decisions about a future waste site will be carefully made.
There will be appropriate public consultation, particularly with First Nations communities, to respect and protect cultural heritage. This will not be a matter of set and forget. We will continue talking to the Australian people about why we are undertaking this transformational endeavour.
A former New South Wales police officer who kicked an Indigenous teenager in the head while he was handcuffed has failed in a bid to have the case dismissed on mental health grounds. Jamie McKinnell reports.
Former Senior Constable Christopher Borg pleaded guilty to 2 counts of assault over the incident during a surveillance operation in Western Sydney in September. The 16-year-old victim was handcuffed and sitting on the ground when Borg kicked him in the head, causing him to fall backwards, and spat on his leg shortly after. In arguing for the case to be dealt with under mental health legislation, his lawyer told Sydney's Downing Centre local court the 42-year-old was a first-time offender and had pre-existing difficulties. Magistrate Susan Horan accepted they included an adjustment disorder, depression and anxiety, but she denied the application, and Borg will be sentenced in May.
China's President Xi Jinping has departed Moscow following a 3-day visit. The two leaders discussed the conflict in Ukraine and vowed to strengthen trade ties between the countries. Russian President Vladimir Putin says China's 12-point peace plan could be used as a basis for ending hostilities in Ukraine. But Western analysts have cast doubt over the peace proposal, saying it doesn't explicitly call for Russian forces to leave Ukraine. Train services have resumed across Greece for the first time since a deadly rail disaster that left 57 people dead. At least 9 people remain in hospital with serious injuries. National and suburban train services restarted along limited sections of the rail network, including the line connecting the capital Athens to the international airport. The head-on collision was the deadliest in Greece's history and has upset the political fortunes of the centre-right government ahead of July's general election. A British judge will open an inquiry into allegations that members of the British Armed Forces killed dozens of unarmed people during military operations in Afghanistan. The British government ordered the inquiry after 2 families launched legal action to demand a judicial review of their cases in which they accused British Special Forces of killing their relatives. Last year, a BBC documentary estimated that elite SAS soldiers had killed 54 people in what was described as suspicious circumstances between mid-2010 and mid-2013. And briefly, Google has now officially launched its own artificial intelligence chatbot called Bard. It's rivaling the popular ChatGPT, which was launched late last year. Showers and possible thunderstorms in many parts of the state tomorrow, more frequent about central and southern parts, dry and sunny in the far west. For Sydney, an overnight low of 18, followed by a partly cloudy day with a high chance of showers and a top of 28. It'll be cloudy on Friday with a high chance of showers again and a top of 26. That's ABC News. It's 6:05.
You're listening to Drive with Richard Glover
on ABC Radio Sydney.
G'day, Richard Glover with you on ABC Radio Sydney. Hope you're well today. Police call out mob violence against rights activists after a church speech delivered by One Nation's Mark Latham. Also today, the woman who has set a new standard for selling clothes that are plastic-free and compostable. You'll meet her and Indira Naidu with the evening show. It's all ahead here on ABC Radio Sydney, on radio at 7:02 a.m, on the ABC Listen app, on digital radio, on TV's Channel 25, and of course online everywhere. Quick check of the traffic.
ABC Radio Sydney traffic.
And actually, there's not too much. Padstow, Clancy Street at Alfords Point Road, the lights are flashing yellow. At Waterfall, those problems still. McKell Avenue between Lady Wakehurst Drive and the vehicle trail, but that's it, according to Live Traffic New South Wales. So if you've spotted anything else, please call us, 1300 222 702 here on Drive. Now, this Saturday is polling day, of course, for the state election. You can cast your vote and eat a democracy sausage or a cupcake, unless you've already voted, as indeed many have. Earlier this week, ABC Sydney reporter Declan Barring visited a pre-polling booth in Emu Plains, which is in the seat of Penrith. The sitting member is the Liberal Stuart Ayres, and he holds the seat with a narrow margin of 0.6%. The Labor candidate, former Penrith Mayor Karen McEwen. And we thought we might take a little bit of a dive into this most interesting seat of Penrith, and Declan is here in the studio. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, so tell us about Penrith.
Penrith, it is, look at 0.6%, as you said, it's
it should be a goer for Labor. You'd think if they want to get government, it would be an absolute pickup. It is the second most marginal seat for the Liberal Party, and Stuart Ayres, he's a cabinet minister. He was very high profile. They've thrown a lot of investment at Penrith and in Western Sydney through a lot of infrastructure projects. So they're desperate to hold on to it. They're desperate to keep Stuart Ayres, but look at that margin.
Mm-hmm. And the Premier has even said because he got thrown out of cabinet, didn't he? But the Premier said if you get him over the line and we get over the line, he'll be back in cabinet.
Exactly. So they're trying to use that personal profile he has as well as the seniority he's held as well. And having said that, that is something that did come up when I was speaking to voters. They'd name drop him. They'd say like, "Oh, yep, I know this guy. He's been the member since 2010." And maybe that's the one thing that's not the one thing, but that is one thing that's probably going for him.
Okay, the name value. What are the issues, do you think?
So when I spoke to voters at the pre-polling booth at Emu Plains, a range of issues kind of came up here. Someone discussed parking at Emu Heights. Someone discussed road projects, health, education. The big one that keeps coming up, as it comes up in most seats, is the cost of living and the impact of rising interest rates, the rising cost of things at supermarkets. That seems to affect people across the board.
Okay, let's listen in.
Climate control and the cost of living, being a pensioner.
Well, I'm not thinking so much about myself, but more about our kids and grandkids. And cost of living obviously is one thing, and it's a bit frightening the way mortgage payments are going as well.
The cost of living, unemployment remains low, but I know they're federal issues as well, but they're driven by state as well.
Some of the voices of Penrith. I love the way state elections, they're often very local, aren't they? So you mentioned the parking at Emu Plains. Alex Greenwich was here on the Political Forum on Monday, and he said the 389 bus. I mean, a one bus route, which apparently is a bit crook at the moment, and that's become an issue for his electorate.
Yeah, some of these election issues are so local once you get down to the pre-polling booths. I was even speaking to the Labor candidate in Heathcote down in the Sutherland Shire, and her pitch to me, the first thing she says was, "Oh, we want more trains running down on the South Coastline." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, of course. That is a very local issue, and it's a state issue too." Yeah.
Well, let's say you also talked to people about who they were voting for so far, because as we've discussed, lots of people have already voted in this election.
Well, that's it. And this is the week where yes, you don't get your democracy sausage, but you get to get your voting out of the way. And so some people, they kind of knew where they wanted to put their votes, and some people had a pretty good idea. Like I said before, that personal, knowing who Stuart Ayres is as a person, maybe they met him on the street, that had a little something that came up every now and then.
Okay, let's listen in again.
I go for the person more than the politics, to be honest.
Tell me about the person who you voted for this time around and why.
Yeah, I voted for Stuart Ayres. I've met him socially quite a few times. I found him very sociable. And if you're walking in the street, he remembers your name.
Who'd you vote for in the end, and why'd you make that decision?
Yeah, I voted Labor. I just think they've got better policies. I think the Liberals are not the party for the people.
My name's Sue and I live in Emu Plains. I still work part-time and I'm a merchandiser. I just trust Liberal. I trust Stuart. I trusted Scott Morrison. I don't trust the Labor. I don't trust the Labor.
Well, there you go. Some of the voters who've already cast their vote in that most tight of seats, and it sounds like it's tight right into the end. I sometimes remember as a parent going to the soccer trophy night at the local school and seeing these politicians. It's quite relatively dull for me that I'd see the local politician standing there for 2 hours and smiling and laughing and shaking everyone's hands afterwards. And I think, God, I wonder why you do this. And that's the answer, isn't it? Because if in the end of the process you've got a bloke on the street saying, I know his name, and he knows my name, it's magic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's the charm of local politics you get when you look at politics through the lens of these polling booths and all that, rather than just down at Macquarie Street.
Yeah, and the statewide polling sometimes can't capture these little individual contests. Yeah, down to whether the 389 bus is any good. Hey, thanks so much. There you go. There's our ABC reporter, Declan Bowring, fresh from discussions at Penrith, where pre-voting, like as in elsewhere, is well underway. It's currently 12 minutes past 6 here on ABC Radio Sydney. Just talking about we were talking about empathy and the points in life where empathy can perhaps be too much. This is interesting from Justin. He's written in, I ruined my own life at one stage when over-empathy led me to help someone way more than I should have, which left me financially, emotionally and mentally depleted. My advice is if over-empathy is starting to impact your own well-being, nip it in the bud early, he says. You can't help anyone if you're broke and under mental duress yourself. That's from Justin. If you want to listen back to that discussion, it was quite interesting. If you're an empath yourself, or you've got a child who's an empath, and understanding how to get the good out of that wonderful thing without sometimes being overburdened by it. Like everything, you can listen back to our discussion online. All of Drive and all the other programs are up on the ABC Listen app, and on your computer you can just choose the little bit of today's program that you want to hear. That bit from 5:30 to 6, of course. 12 minutes past 6 is the time. Now, I wonder if you remember seeing Craig Rucastle's show, The War on Waste, and those shots he had of, some of it was shot in Martin Place with these huge piles of unwanted clothes just waiting to be trucked off to a landfill site. Every year, Australians acquire, on average, 27 kilos of new clothing per person. And they chuck out 23 kilos each year. Now, if you're like me, you're not buying anywhere near that quantity, so some people must be buying 40 kilos or more and throwing out equal amounts. It all adds up to 800,000 tonnes of clothing and textiles that are discarded by Australians each year, and 90% of them end up in landfill. So what can be done? Well, obviously part of the answer is to buy fewer clothes and make them last longer. But once they do come to an end of their lives, could they be made so they are easier to compost and therefore don't add to landfill? Well, Stephanie Devine is the CEO and founder of The Very Good Bra, has been designing and selling plastic-free, compostable bras, briefs and sleepwear, and has had some good news this week, and that Standards Australia has accepted just yesterday a proposal of a technical specification for compostable textiles after Stephanie's work and lobbying in this area, and she joins us here on Drive. Stephanie, good afternoon.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Nice to chat.
Yeah, I mean, there's an important news yesterday, or an important statement yesterday, which we'll come to. But can you start off by telling us how you came to this, how you came involved in it?
Yeah, look, I'd been making, it was my ambition in 2018 to make the world's first circular economy bra. And I soon worked out the only way that I could do that was to have it be botanically circular, so use completely 100% natural fabrics, because no one wants recycled undies, let's be honest. And so I used all of these natural materials, and then I worked hard with, external parties like commercial worm farms and composters to make sure that my stuff did compost. So it's made of natural rubber, 100% organic cotton, no polyester, no nylon, no spandex. So it all composted and wormed within 8 weeks. But I was unable to prove that in any kind of formal sense, and that's how the standard started.
There was also, you had an experience of breast cancer, didn't you? And at that point, you were looking for a bra for yourself.
Absolutely. So it all started with breast cancer in 2006, much earlier, and that was I was in a corporate role, and I just couldn't find a non-wide bra in a proper cup size lined with a natural fibre, because I'm a non-traditional size, and it just really stuck with me for such a long time that 1 in 8 women are going to get breast cancer. Why can't we find this basic product that we need? So it took me a while, to get through that and to get better, to just think that I'm going to change this. I'm going to do something different. And now I make bras in up to 28 sizes in 100% natural fibres. So the same size range really as conventional bra companies. So it was very much that drove me. And then once I learned about the circular economy and about the landfill and textiles to landfill, I just thought, I've got to do something that's really important.
Now, no one else is doing this in the world. Why is it so hard to build a bra without wire or plastic?
Well, everyone uses spandex because it's just so much easier to get something to fit if it's really stretchy and it sticks to your body. So in terms of making a product, most bras are just a foam cup, a bit of wire and, some polyester and lace over the top of them. It's very, very easy to make that. But to find a factory that can cut and sew materials and natural materials and only really use the mechanical stretch of the material is actually very hard. And also the materials are very expensive. So, my elastic, my sewing thread, they're all at least 10 times more expensive than conventional materials. So for most big lingerie companies, they're just not going to dabble in it because they can't make the margins.
Now we come to Standards Australia. So explain the problem, because you've been campaigning to get them to have these technical specifications so everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about compostable textiles.
That's right. So I worked hard. I talked to composters and they said, yes, we can take your product if it has an AS4736. And I thought, great. So I go to a lab and say, can you test this against AS4736? And they say, no, that's only actually used for bioplastics and food containers. So that you can't use it. So I kept going around in circles. So because they couldn't test my textile against this already existing standard for bioplastic bags, we just couldn't get anywhere, even though we're technically looking for the same chemicals, the same plastics, the same dangerous metals. And in the end, I decided to have a go at it myself, not really realizing how difficult and how complicated it was, and how I might need a degree in biochemical engineering.
Well, you got through to them. They've yesterday accepted this proposal, and I know that Brooke Summers from Cotton Australia, who supported all of this, said this is. There's a scalability, to use that word. In other words, other people will be able to use this standard to create other products that do this.
Absolutely. So, there are some super, possibilities for this. Just if you think about sheets and towels and those sorts of things, if they were sewn with cotton instead of polyester, they could all end up in the end, once they're ripped and they've been used as rags and everything, and there's no life left in them, they could actually end up in compost, where they are additive to compost rather than in landfill, just giving off methane gas. So there's great applicability there, but also for people who are just making T-shirts, just make it with a cotton label, make it with cotton sewing thread, and this could potentially be a product that can meet the Australian standard. But the other important thing, and for me really, it's not just about the end of life, it's also about the process of the garment's life. So all polyester products are giving off microplastics when they're washed every single time. So by encouraging people to make with natural fibres, we are minimising that microplastic problem in our oceans. So it's through all aspects of the life cycle of a product.
And this is the frustrating thing. You might have a T-shirt, or a sheet is an even better example, where it's 99.9% cotton actually, so it's fine, but it's stitched with it's got a polyester label and maybe polyester stitching, and that's enough to stop it ever being put in a worm farm.
That's exactly right. So this encourages all of those big manufacturers of those things. And workwear is another big example of it. And the industry is trying really hard to find solutions, because if you think every single poster you see around is wearing a plastic jacket that's going to go into landfill. So workwear is a big market for this. If they can just make in cotton, they can sew in cotton, use cotton labels and just design for disassembly when it comes to zips and metals so that they come off, then that again is another massive contribution to avoiding textiles going into landfill. So it's very exciting, the possibility. And once the standard is there, people can work towards that standard. It gives us something to aim towards.
Well, good on you, good on Standards Australia, good on Cotton Australia, which was part of it too. And thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Stephanie Devine is the CEO and founder of the Very Good Bra Company, and they're the ones who've only one in the world who are trying to produce these completely compostable products. and in their case, in bras and briefs and sleepwear. But as she said, the possibilities are endless. 1300 222 702 is the number if you want to text us. 0467 922 702. Declan mentioned that the big issue in the polling station he went to at Emu Plains was the parking at Emu Plains. I mentioned Alex Greenwich saying, look, 389. But when asked him the big issues, he did mention gambling and a few other huge things like that. But he said, actually, in my electorate, the 389 bus. What is the tiny issue, the hyper-local issue in your area where you reckon people will be determining their vote, not on one of these big deal issues, the $400 or the, what are the other big issues, the tolls or whatever, but something that is unique to your area? What's the tiny issue? The 389 bus, the parking at Emu Plains. Actually, Jen at DY has another on the text. She says, in the Wakehurst electorate, the buses are the really huge issue and may decide the seat. So, yeah, buses in Wakehurst, buses again in Sydney, in Alex Greenwich's Sydney, and the parking at Emu Plains. What's the hyper-local issue where you are? Tell us. 0467 922 702, the latest traffic.
ABC Radio Sydney traffic.
Jeff Wallace is here from the Australian Traffic Network. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Rich. I'm seeing the Anzac Bridge on the crawl out from Darling Harbour, Piermont in towards Rozelle, and North Ryder crawl as well for Lane Cove Road past the Epping Road flyover, all the way down towards roads over the Ryde Bridge. Padstow lights are out, Clancy Street, Alfords Point Road and Richmond Road, off the M7 northbound, slowing up towards Townsend Road. I'm Jeff Wallace, the Australian Traffic Network.
Jeff, thank you very much. Lots of enthusiasm on the text about Stephanie Devine and that project with cottons and making them able to be composted. She's got this bra that she's even tested this out in 2019. It was eaten all up in a worm farm in 8 weeks. So there you go. It does work. Liz says it should be made illegal to make or sell polyester or microfiber sheets. We've got to stop the endless microplastics that will never break down. And someone else says clothes would last longer if they banned elastin. Elastin is the stuff that wears out quickly and causes clothes to go like a saggy, baggy elephant. So there you go. It's 23 minutes past 6 here on ABC Radio Sydney. Indira next.
Simone Young is one of the most talented conductors of her generation.
When I started, I faced considerable opposition.
Executive producer Kate Blanchett takes us into the world of one of our greatest conductors.
In 1991, there were no women conductors.
What does being a woman have to do with conducting?
She's not afraid to just be a boss. Simone Young.
She was born to be a conductor.
Knowing the Score.
It is magic.
Streaming now on ABC iView.
What's the hyper-local issue in your electorate? We have the 389 bus in the Sydney electorate. We've got the Emu Plains parking in Penrith. Someone says that where they are in Wakehurst, it's the buses. The local issue in Hornsby Heights, the maintenance of Gorleston Gorge, which allows it to not suffer landslides during heavy rain. Yeah, it's one of those bits of Sydney infrastructure that seems to be closed half the time, doesn't it? So the maintenance of Gorleston Gorge, that's the hyper-local issue in Hornsby Heights. In Heathcote, it's about koala protection, says Kelly in Warranora Heights. So, yeah, what about the seat you're in? What is the hyper-local issue? Is it down to the local buses and parking? Is it something like koala protection? Yeah, tell us, 1300 222 702. Indira Naidu is here. Good afternoon.
We've got a burst water main on our street.
Well,
that's how hyper-local.
Vote on that.
Yeah.
Forget about selling off Sydney water. Just keep it from gushing.
Well, there's so much water that's being wasted.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It is terrible. Richard, on the show tonight, the question we're asking when we play the quiz, if you could have an unlimited supply of anything other than money for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Sydney water. Sydney water.
I've got plenty of that at the moment.
Sydney water is the best thing. It's the best. It's one of those things that we don't appreciate enough. That we live in a city where you can water the garden or you can take a beautiful glass of water and it's the most perfect, beautiful drink and it tastes better than the posh French stuff that costs $15.
And we're wasting all this money. I know.
And we already have an unlimited supply of it.
Well, I just fill up my bottle with tap water. That's what I drink.
So what do you want an unlimited supply of?
Oh, cheese twisties.
But that wouldn't be good for you.
No, I know. But then I think what I actually need an unlimited supply of is
willpower,
self-control. But then there's things like, what about frequent flyer points? Wouldn't you love all of those, Richard?
Gee, I think willpower's a good answer, though, isn't it? I wonder if people...
Or a better one, maybe, time.
Time would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Happiness?
Happiness?
Yeah.
Or just, chocolate crackles after yesterday's discussion.
Exactly.
Now, Paul McDermott is on the show today.
Yeah, isn't that terrific? We're catching up with him. We celebrate lots of ABC and television stars in this segment. And, of course, he's very loved for Good News Week, the Doug Anthony All-Stars.
Has he still got that beard?
I'm not sure.
Because he had that TV show, the quiz show,
Think Tank,
and suddenly he appeared, and he looked
with
quite
this
different.
long beard.
Yeah.
So I'll ask him about whether he still has that. And then we're getting an opera singing lesson from an opera star from Madama Butterfly, which is being set up at the Botanic Gardens as we speak.
It's such a physical thing, isn't it? We've had a few over the years on Thank God It's Friday when we've had our live audiences, and so you're very close to them. I'm often standing really, half a metre from them, and the whole room is kind of shaking with this force, and it's so sort of exciting.
It is. I mean, they generate so much power. And this particular opera singer, she's a soprano. She also drives a motorbike, but she trained as an engineer, so she's quite a fascinating character, so I can't wait to get to know her. And then I want to hear about your favourite country pub. That's what we're celebrating.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you love it? Is it the live music? Maybe it's a chicken palmy you like. We've got some holidays, Easter coming up. A lot of people like doing those country
And there's
drives.
kind of two categories, isn't there? There's the fancy pub and then the kind of traditional
Yeah, the
pub.
gastropub.
The
or the
gastropub.
traditional
So there's one in Traralgon, which used to be an ordinary pub and now it's a fancy pub.
Oh.
And I still don't quite know. I appreciate both of them, actually.
Yeah. Well, I was in Bega recently and they've just done up the Tathra pub just out of Bega. And it's a lot of the big companies have wanted to buy it because it's great. It's right there on the headland, beautiful view, old 1880s building, sandstone.
That famous wharf they've got there.
Yeah,
don't
the
they?
famous wharf. And the owners, though, said, no, we want to keep it local, live music, keep it very simple. And they do a roaring trade, because it's not really fancy, but the food's good and honest, and that live music really brings the locals together.
Because someone was telling me about Narooma, where one of those big Sydney companies has taken over, and suddenly the locals, it's all very expensive and,
Yeah, so we want to celebrate pubs because they've had a bad couple of years, obviously, with lockdowns. Some of them are now coming back, and it's important to support them.
This is Sally on the text. Gosh, Indira has the most perfect radio voice and the most perfect TV presence. I love her.
Oh.
What about me?
Oh, that's lovely.
What about my radio voice? It's lovely, isn't it?
Did I tell you did I tell you my mother's name is Sally? That's actually probably Mum.
That's not true. That's not true.
Sally, that's very lovely. Thank you.
She'll be particularly good on the evening show tonight with that sort of praise. Hey, good on you. Thank you. It's all coming up in a second. We're asking what the micro issues were in your electorate. What are the things that are maybe small local issues that would not be known about much outside your electorate, but might actually cause the vote to go one way or the other? This is from Lawrence in Manly. In the Manly electorate, there are two small, large things, he calls them: the reliability of our Manly ferries, where the important ones are continuing to break down, and the forced council of amalgamations still. In Willoughby, one major issue is the government's proposed plan to redevelop public land at the Royal North Shore Hospital for non-healthcare reasons. We're worried about that, says Bruce. Environmental destruction for an exclusive professional multi-field and licensed facility for the Eastwood Rugby Club in Castle Hill. That's the big issue there. What else? Solar farms on agricultural land, or the Blackheath to Hartley Tunnel. They're the big ones in Bathurst, according to James. Isn't it interesting? The local issues in Camden electorate are the lack of schools and safe school crossings in the newer areas. In Camden itself, it's a possibility that the fire station may be closed down. That's from Anne in Mount Annan. So isn't it interesting? This election on Saturday may be determined by a whole lot of issues that most of us were not even particularly aware of. So there you go. PM now, then Indira. It's 6:30.